Story 1. I was a trucker in Alaska. This is what killed those campers back in 1998. You see, hauling freight up the Dalton Highway was a lonely life, but it paid the bills. The vast emptiness. The endless spruce forests pressing against the thin ribbon of road. The unnerving quiet. It all got to you after a while. But nothing got to me, like what happened near Chandler Shelf. I was headed north with a load of drilling equipment, pushing hard to make Fairbanks before the first serious snowfall. It was late September, and the nights were already drawing in, the air sharp with a winter bite. Just as twilight was settling, I saw their campfire flickering through the trees, a small, inviting orange glow in the gathering gloom. I'd seen campers like them before, young folks chasing the wilderness high, oblivious to the real dangers lurking beyond the firelight. A nagging feeling prompted me to pull over. It wasn't logical, just an unease that settled deep in my gut. I grabbed a thermos of coffee and walked towards the campsite. 3 tents were huddled together near a crackling fire, but there was no sign of life. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the stillness. Silence. I moved closer, a prickle of apprehension crawling up my spine. The scene was unsettling. Plates and cups lay scattered around the fire pit, as if abandoned mid-meal. One of the tents had been ripped open, the fabric torn raggedly. I peered inside, my breath catching in my throat. A sleeping bag lay empty and twisted, a smear of dark, viscous fluid staining the nylon. A sound, a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground, spun me around. Standing at the edge of the trees, soaked in the fading light, was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and spindly, ending in hands that looked more like claws. Its skin was a sickly pale green, stretched tight over sharp bones. Its face, if you could call it a face, was a grotesque parody of human features, dominated by a gaping maw filled with needle-sharp teeth. The Bushman. Whispers about it circulated among the truckers, tales of a creature that stalked the deep woods, a predator that left no survivors. I dismissed them as campfire stories, the product of too much solitude and too much cheap whiskey. Now, staring into the hollow eyes of the beast, I knew the stories were true. The Bushman moved with unnerving speed, its long legs covering the ground in impossibly long strides. I stumbled backward, my mind screaming in disbelief, my body paralyzed with terror. The creature let out a guttural roar, a sound that ripped through the quiet of the evening. I turned and ran, adrenaline surging through my veins. The image of the torn tent and the dark stain burned into my memory. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I scrambled inside, slammed the door, and locked it, my heart hammering against my ribs. Through the rearview mirror, I saw the Bushman emerge from the trees, its silhouette outlined against the dying embers of the campfire. It stood there for a moment, a silent, menacing presence, then turned and vanished back into the darkness. I hit the gas, the truck roaring to life, and sped away, leaving the horror behind me. The next few miles were a blur of taillights and flashing headlights, the rhythmic drone of the engine a fragile barrier against the terror that clawed at my mind. I kept expecting to see the Bushman in my rearview mirror, its skeletal face leering at me through the glass, but it didn't appear. I made it to Fairbanks just before dawn, a shaken, hollowed-out version of the man who'd left Prudhoe Bay 2 days earlier. I reported what I'd seen to the authorities, but they dismissed it as a hallucination, the product of fatigue and isolation. They searched the campsite, found nothing. No bodies. No sign of a struggle, just 3 abandoned tents and a cold fire pit. They suggested I take some time off, get some rest. Rest wouldn't erase the image of the Bushman, wouldn't quiet the screams echoing in my memory. I quit my job the next day, sold my rig, packed my bags, and left Alaska. I haven't been back since. The vast emptiness, the whispering trees, the unnerving quiet, it all holds the memory of that night, the memory of the Bushman, and the campers who vanished without a trace. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside my window, I still see its silhouette, its pale green skin and gaping maw, a specter haunting the edges of my sanity. The Alaskan wilderness holds its secrets close, and I pray I never have to face them again. Story 2. The Alaskan Sun, a pale ghost in the November sky, blood across the snow-covered peaks as I steered my rig towards Prudhoe Bay. The contract was good, the money better, and I needed both. A plume of diesel exhaust, my only companion, trailed behind me like a phantom ribbon. About 50 miles out of Coldfoot, I saw him. A figure bundled in layers, thumb jutting out against the vast emptiness. Something about the way he stood, so still against the howling wind, struck me as odd. But the Arctic breeds a certain solitary madness, and I'd seen enough strange souls to fill a psych ward. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. He climbed into the cab, bringing a gust of icy air and a pungent odor, something like wet fur and rotting meat. He muttered a thanks, his voice a raspy whisper. I caught a glimpse of his face beneath the thick hood, weathered, almost leathery skin, and eyes that seemed to absorb the dim light. We drove in silence for a while. The only sounds the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the tires against the packed ice. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in bruised purples and sickly greens. I glanced over at my passenger. He sat rigid, his gaze fixed on something beyond the windshield, something I couldn't see. A prickle of unease crawled up my spine. The change started subtly. A twitch in his jaw, a flexing of his fingers. Then his skin began to shift, rippling beneath his clothes. The stench intensified, making my stomach churn. His eyes, now wide and gleaming, reflected a feral light. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that vibrated through the very metal of the truck. He lunged. Claws, sharp as shards of glass, ripped through his gloves. His teeth, elongated and yellowed, snapped at my face. I swerved, the truck fishtailing on the ice. We were locked in a desperate struggle, his inhuman strength surprising. I managed to grab a tire iron from behind the seat, bringing it down on his head. He shrieked, a sound that was both animal and human, and recoiled. But the blow only seemed to enrage him. His body contorted, bones cracking and reforming. Fur sprouted, thick and gray. His face lengthened into a snout, his eyes burning with predatory hunger. It was a skinwalker. The legends whispered about in hushed tones around flickering fires were true. I was trapped in a steel cage with a creature from the darkest corners of Athabascan folklore. The skinwalker lunged again, its claws tearing at my arm. I screamed, pain searing through me. I fought back, wielding the tire iron like a club, desperation lending me strength. We grappled, the cab a whirlwind of fur and fury. The truck careened across the ice, the world outside a blur of white and gray. I knew I couldn't win this fight. Not through brute force. I had to be smarter. I saw the emergency brake handle, a glimmer of hope in the chaos. With a surge of adrenaline, I slammed my foot onto the pedal, simultaneously yanking the handle. The truck spun violently, throwing the skinwalker off balance. It slammed against the passenger door, momentarily stunned. This was my chance. I grabbed the aerosol can of pepper spray I kept for grizzlies, pointed it at the creature's face, and pressed down on the nozzle. A cloud of orange mist filled the cab. The skinwalker howled, a sound of pure agony, its eyes squeezed shut. I kicked open the passenger door and shoved it out into the snow. It landed with a thud, thrashing and screeching in the biting cold. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and floored the accelerator. The truck roared back to life, leaving the squirming form behind in the swirling snow. I didn't look back. I drove for hours, the image of the transforming hitchhiker seared into my mind. The pain in my arm was a constant reminder of my close call. As the first rays of dawn finally kissed the horizon, I pulled into Dead Horse, exhausted and shaken to my core. I never picked up another hitchhiker. The vastness of the Alaskan wilderness, once a symbol of freedom, now felt like a prison, its beauty tainted by the horror I had witnessed. The memory of the skinwalker, the chilling transformation, the desperate fight for survival, would forever haunt the icy roads of my mind. Story 3. The wind howled a mournful tune through Chilcote Pass, whipping snowflakes into a frenzy that obscured the already fading twilight. My cargo, crates of medical supplies destined for Dawson City, shifted uneasily in the trailer as I navigated the treacherous ice-slicked road. This late in the season, I was likely the last trucker crazy enough to be this far north. A flicker of movement in my peripheral vision caught my eye. Through the swirling snow, I saw it a train, an old steam locomotive pulling a string of passenger cars. Emerging from the blizzard as if from thin air, it was a relic of the Klondike Gold Rush, a phantom from a bygone era. The sight sent a shiver down my spine, a chill that had nothing to do with the sub-zero temperature. It shouldn't have been there. No tracks ran through this pass. As the apparition drew closer, I could make out the spectral figures within the carriages. Their faces, pale and gaunt, were pressed against the frosted windows. They seemed to beckon, their skeletal arms outstretched, their eyes fixed on me with an unsettling intensity. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles white, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. The train moved with an unnatural silence, its wheels not making a sound against the frozen ground. It glided past my rig, its icy breath washing over me, a spectral wave of cold that seemed to seep into my very bones. The faces in the windows were closer now, their expressions a mixture of sorrow and pleading. They whispered, their voices carried on the wind, faint and indistinct, yet somehow I understood. They were calling me, urging me to join them. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator, an irrational urge to escape this unsettling spectacle. But the train, despite its seemingly slow pace, stayed abreast of me, its presence a suffocating weight on my chest. The landscape, already bleak and desolate, seemed to warp around the train, the snow-covered mountains closing in. The narrow road leading towards a precipice I hadn't noticed before, a gaping chasm of ice and shadow. The whispers intensified, swirling around me like the blizzard itself. They promised warmth, respite, an end to the loneliness of the road. My vision blurred, the figures in the train morphing into familiar faces, my long-lost wife, my parents, friends I'd left behind. They smiled, their voices growing clearer, more enticing. The truck began to drift towards the edge of the abyss, the pull of the spectral train becoming almost irresistible. I fought against it, wrenching the wheel, but it was no use. The truck slid further, the chasm yawning below, its darkness promising oblivion. The whispers were now shouts, joyous and welcoming, drowning out the wind, filling my mind with a false sense of peace. Then, as the front tires teetered precariously over the edge, I saw it. At the bottom of the chasm, amidst the jagged ice, lay the wreckage of another truck, twisted and mangled, its cab crushed. Beside it, scattered across the frozen wasteland, were skeletal remains, still clad in tattered remnants of winter clothing. They were the previous victims of this spectral trap, their outstretched arms frozen in a perpetual plea. The sight snapped me out of the trance. The faces in the train, no longer familiar, twisted into grotesque masks of despair. Their whispers turned to shrieks of anguish, accusing, condemning. This wasn't an invitation to warmth and rest. It was a lure to a frozen grave. With a surge of adrenaline, I slammed my foot on the brake, the tires screeching against the ice. The truck lurched violently, halting just inches from the edge. The spectral train, its illusion shattered, began to fade, its ghostly passengers dissolving back into the blizzard. Their screams, however, lingered, echoing through the mountain pass. A chilling reminder of the fate I had narrowly avoided. Shaking and drenched in a cold sweat, I put the truck in reverse, slowly backing away from the precipice. The phantom train was gone, but the chasm remained, a dark scar on the landscape. I didn't stop driving until I reached Dawson City, the lights of the small town a beacon of sanity in a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly unreal. Even now, years later, the memory of that night still haunts me. The whispers of the ghostly passengers, the icy breath of the train, the pull of the abyss, they remain, etched into my mind. A constant reminder of the unseen horrors that lurk in the desolate corners of the Yukon. I never haul cargo through Chilkoot Pass again. The gold rush may be over, but its ghosts still linger, waiting for their next victim. Story 4. The fluorescent lights of the rest stop buzzed, their sickly glow reflecting off the grimy tile floor. I stretched, my back stiff from hours hunched over the wheel, hauling a load of frozen fish south. The aroma of stale coffee hung thick in the air, mingling with the faint, chemical tang of disinfectant. This place was a pit stop, a purgatory between long stretches of desolate highway. I needed to use the restroom and grab another lukewarm cup of coffee before tackling the next leg of my journey. The men's room was deserted. I finished my business and headed back to the main area, only to find the access blocked by a yellow caution tape stretched across the hallway. A hand-lettered sign taped to it read, "Elevator out of order, use stairs." Groaning inwardly, I trudged toward the stairwell, a metal cage bolted to the exterior of the building. Alaska and its constant maintenance woes. But as I reached the door, a flicker of movement caught my eye. The elevator doors slid open, revealing a dimly lit cabin. Hesitation warred with impatience. The stairs meant a long climb up to the main floor, followed by a descent back down to the parking lot. The elevator, despite the warning sign, offered a swift, albeit potentially sketchy, shortcut. Impatience won. I stepped inside. The doors hissed shut, and the elevator lurched upward. For a moment, everything seemed normal, the familiar hum of machinery vibrating beneath my feet. Then, the cabin shuddered violently, the lights flickered, and the car stopped. I jabbed at the button for the main floor. Nothing. I mashed the emergency button. Still nothing. Trapped. A low, croaky whisper snaked through the ventilation grates above. It was a sound that resonated deep in my bones, a sound that spoke of something ancient and malevolent. The air inside the cabin grew cold, a biting chill that had nothing to do with the Alaskan winter outside. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing unnervingly in the confined space. My only response was another whisper, closer this time, laced with a chilling amusement. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through me. I pounded on the metal doors, yelling for help. My voice was swallowed by the thick steel, absorbed by the oppressive silence beyond. The whispers intensified, coalescing into gravelly words I couldn't quite decipher. They seemed to swirl around me, probing, testing. I felt a presence. Something unseen yet undeniably there, watching me from the darkness beyond the metal walls. A wave of dizziness washed over me. The temperature plummeted further, the air growing heavy, almost viscous. My breath condensed into visible clouds in front of my face. The metallic scent of the cabin was replaced by a cloying sweetness, like overripe fruit rotting in the sun. The whispers became clearer now, weaving themselves into a disturbing narrative. They spoke of loneliness, of hunger, of an unending thirst for something I couldn't comprehend. They painted images in my mind. Twisted landscapes, shadowed figures, and a gaping void filled with an infinite darkness. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. I slid down the wall, my legs giving way beneath me. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my hands against my ears, trying to block out the insidious whispers that burrowed into my mind. Then, a new sound emerged from the vents, a low, rhythmic chanting that pulsed with an unsettling power. The elevator car began to vibrate in time with the chant, shaking with increasing intensity. The metal walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, as if the cabin itself were alive. The chanting grew louder, the vibrations stronger. The whispers, now a chorus of voices, spoke of a feast, a ritual, a sacrifice. They told me I was chosen, that I was the offering. The floor beneath me seemed to dissolve. I looked down and saw, not the metal floor of the elevator, but a swirling vortex of darkness, a bottomless pit that stretched down into an endless abyss. The chanting reached a crescendo. The cabin shook violently, and I felt myself being pulled downwards, into the void. With a final, deafening roar, the elevator plunged. The darkness consumed me, and the whispers, finally triumphant, filled my mind. Story 5. My blood, slick and dark against the Arctic snow, seemed to steam in the sub-zero air. The creature, no longer remotely human, stood over me, its breath clouding around a face that shifted and pulsed with newly acquired flesh. My leg, twisted at an unnatural angle, throbbed to the pain that barely registered over the terror gripping me. I could see Fairbanks, a pinprick of distant light, mocking me with its unattainable promise of safety. How had a simple delivery turned into this nightmare? It had started with a message on a forum I frequented, one of those encrypted corners of the web where discretion was currency. A user, calling themselves Glacier, offered an exorbitant sum to transport a sensitive item from a remote airstrip outside Nome to Fairbanks, no questions asked. The money was ludicrous, enough to wipe out my debts and set me up for life. My gut screamed at me, but the allure of financial freedom drowned it out. The airstrip was deserted, save for a small, unmarked Cessna that looked like it had seen better days. A man in a nondescript parka and mirrored sunglasses emerged, his face obscured by the shadows of his hood. He gestured towards a large, metal crate chained to the plane's cargo bay. Or package, he said, his voice flat and devoid of inflection. He handed me a heavily encrypted data pad. Delivery instructions. Do not deviate. Then he was gone, disappearing back into the Cessna as quickly as he'd arrived. The crate was unnervingly cold, radiating an unnatural chill that seeped through my gloves. I winched it onto my flatbed, securing it with heavy chains. As I climbed into the cab, the data pad flickered to life, displaying a single, stark message. Destination: Fairbanks. No stops, no communication. Below it, a timer counted down. 72 hours. The first few hours were uneventful. The vast, desolate landscape of the Alaskan interior stretched before me. An endless expanse of snow and ice under a sky pregnant with the promise of more snow. But as dusk began to settle, a low hum began emanating from the crate. I dismissed it at first, attributing it to the vibrations of the truck. But it grew steadily louder, morphing into a rhythmic pulse that seemed to resonate within my own skull. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the road ahead. But then, the temperature inside the cab began to drop precipitously. My breath formed icy clouds, and frost began to bloom on the windows. The humming intensified, accompanied now by a faint scratching sound, as if something were trying to claw its way out. Panic gnawed at me. I considered turning back, abandoning the cargo. But the thought of the money, so close now, kept me going. By nightfall, the scratching had become a frantic scraping, and the humming had escalated into a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the entire truck. I pulled over, heart pounding against my ribs, and cautiously approached the crate. The metal was freezing to the touch, coated in a thin layer of frost. I pressed my ear against the cold surface. A faint whisper, barely audible over the throbbing hum, reached me. It sounded human, a single word, repeated over and over again. Release. My hand trembled as I reached for the lock. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to stop, but a morbid curiosity, fueled by equal parts fear and greed, propelled me forward. I fumbled with the padlock, my fingers numb with cold. The lock clicked open. The crate lid burst inwards, propelled by an unseen force. A cloud of vapor billowed out, obscuring my vision. When it cleared, I was staring into the face of something. It was humanoid, vaguely female in form, but its skin was an unsettling shade of gray, almost translucent. Its eyes, large and black, lacked pupils, and its head was abnormally large, perched atop a thin, fragile neck. It was naked, its body emaciated, covered in a network of strange, pulsating veins. It looked at me, its expression unreadable. Then, with a speed that defied its frail appearance, it lunged. The following hours are a blur of terror and pain. The creature, imbued with an unnatural strength, overpowered me easily. It changed. Its flesh filled out, taking on a more human appearance. Its eyes gained color, its hair sprouted, thick and black. It became beautiful in a disturbing, otherworldly way. But its gaze remained cold, predatory. It spoke, its voice a melodious whisper that belied the horror unfolding before me. It told me of its origins, of experiments conducted in a secret facility, of a desperate escape. It spoke of a hunger, a deep, insatiable need to consume, and then it began to feed. Now, lying here in the snow, watching it stand over me, I understand. I was never meant to deliver the cargo. I was the cargo. Story 6. The permafrost crunched beneath my boots as I surveyed the site, a jumble of weathered wooden crosses and cairns, half buried by the relentless Alaskan scrub. Old Man Hemlock, a grizzled prospector I'd met in talk, had warned me. Them's Bushman graves, son. Best leave MB. But Old Man Hemlock was also known for his moonshine-fueled ramblings. And I had a schedule to keep. My rig, loaded with drilling equipment destined for a remote site north of the Arctic Circle, needed to be there yesterday. This supposed burial ground was right in the path of the quickest shortcut. So, I ignored the creeping unease in my gut and revved the engine, the heavy tires churning the sacred ground as I plowed through the makeshift cemetery. I told myself it was all superstition, just rocks and rotting wood. The first sign something was wrong came a few hours later. A flicker in my peripheral vision. A shape just beyond the tree line, swift and fleeting like a caribou spooked by the growl of my engine. But there were no caribou this far north. I dismissed it as a trick of the light, the long Alaskan twilight playing games with my eyes. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in a non-existent breeze. They seemed to slither from the dense spruce forests that pressed in on either side of the narrow, unpaved road. I cranked up the heater, trying to drown out the sound, but it seemed to weave its way through the vents, a chorus of unintelligible murmurs circling my head. By nightfall, the whispers had become words, fragmented and croaky, a language I'd never heard but instinctively understood to be filled with malice. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles bone white, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I pulled over, convinced I needed sleep. The thought of continuing through the night, with that disembodied chorus dogging my every mile, was unbearable. I parked by a frozen creek, the ice reflecting the eerie glow of the polar light. The whispers continued, even with the engine off. They seemed to emanate from the very air itself. Sleep never came. Instead, I lay rigid in my bunk, eyes wide open, listening as the whispers coalesced into a single voice, cold and sharp as shattered glass. It spoke my name. Dawn broke, gray and unforgiving. I felt drained as if I hadn't slept at all. The whispering had stopped. Maybe, I thought. It had all been a bad dream brought on by old Hemlock's stories and too much stale coffee. As I drove, the landscape began to shift, taking on an unsettling, dreamlike quality. The trees seemed to lean inwards, their branches clawing at the truck. The snow-covered ground undulated like a restless sea. I felt a growing sense of unreality, a disconnection from my own body. It was like I was watching myself from a distance, a passenger in my own life. Then, I saw it. Standing by the side of the road, a figure cloaked in furs, its face obscured by a deep hood. It was impossibly still, a statue against the swirling snow. I slowed down, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. As I drew level, the figure raised its head. The face beneath the hood was not a face. It was a smooth, featureless expanse of skin, the color of aged parchment. Where eyes should have been, there were only 2 empty sockets. Bottomless pits of darkness. The sight of it sent a wave of pure, visceral terror through me. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, desperate to escape the sight of it. The image of that blank face burned into my retinas. The truck roared to life, but it was too late. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered, a suffocating weight in the cabin. The whispers returned, louder than ever, swirling around me, mocking my fear. They spoke of ancient curses and forgotten rituals, of a land that did not forgive trespassers. I drove for what felt like days, lost in a labyrinth of ice and snow. The landscape outside the window became a blur of distorted shapes and unsettling shadows. The whispers were constant now, a cacophony of voices inside my head driving me to the brink of madness. I could feel myself losing grip on reality, the line between dream and waking life blurring. Finally, the truck sputtered and died, the engine giving one last, agonizing groan before falling silent. I was stranded alone, in the heart of the Alaskan wilderness, with nothing but the whispering voices and the memory of that faceless being for company. I knew then, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I had made a terrible mistake. I had violated something sacred, and now I was paying the price. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into a single, deafening roar. The truck began to shake violently, as if something immense was trying to break free from within. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the inevitable. The last thing I heard, before the world dissolved into darkness, was the sound of my own name, whispered on the wind. Story 7. My blood, sticky and warm on my torn shirt, felt less like mine and more like a lubricant for the teeth sawing into my arm. The biggest of them, the cook I guessed from his stained apron, growled a gravelly laugh, spraying bits of me across the checkered floor. My scream was swallowed by the joyous howls of the pack. They were dogmen, every last patron in Dogman's diner, and I was their dinner. How had I been so blind? The signs were there, glaring now in the grim tableau of my final moments. I remember pulling up to the diner, grateful for the lights spilling out onto the snow-covered Alaskan highway. My rig, loaded with medical equipment for a clinic in Nam, felt heavy and unresponsive after 12 hours of navigating icy roads. The diner, a low-slung building with a flickering neon sign shaped like a snarling wolf, should have been my first warning. But exhaustion dulled my instincts, the promise of hot coffee and a warm meal overriding the prickle of unease that ran down my spine as I walked towards the door. A bell, slightly off-key, jangled as I entered. The warmth inside was stifling, heavy with the smell of something gamey and sweet, like overcooked venison and cinnamon. The patrons, maybe 8 in all, sat hunched over their meals in booths lining the walls. They all wore heavy parkas, hoods pulled low, obscuring their faces in shadow. The only light came from a few dim bulbs overhead and the glow of the open kitchen. As I walked to the counter, I noticed their silence. No clatter of cutlery, no murmur of conversation, just the rhythmic, wet sounds of chewing. A large, hairy figure emerged from the kitchen. The cook. He was easily 7 feet tall, built like a grizzly bear, with thick, matted fur sprouting from beneath his apron. His face, what I could see of it under the shadow of his baseball cap, was broad and flat, with a wide, lipless mouth full of yellowed teeth. He grunted a greeting, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "Coffee?" I asked, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the oppressive quiet. He nodded and turned to the coffee machine, his back a wall of muscle and fur. As I waited, I looked around the diner again. A faint growl seemed to emanate from the booths, and I noticed that the patrons were all staring at me. Their parkas seemed to shift and rustle, as if the figures inside were too large to be contained. A wave of nausea rolled over me. The sweet, gamey smell intensified, and I realized, with growing horror, what it reminded me of: wet dog. The cook placed a thick mug in front of me. The coffee smelled bitter and metallic. I took a tentative sip, the liquid burning my tongue. "Anything to eat," he rumbled. I shook my head. "Just the coffee, thanks." He didn't move, his eyes, small and black, fixed on me. "You sure? We got specials." A chorus of growls echoed his words. The figures in the booth shifted again, their parkas rustling louder. I could feel their gaze, heavy and predatory, boring into me. I tried to stand to back away, but my legs felt leaden. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped my heart. I need to get back on the road, I stammered, pushing the mug away. The cook took a step closer, his shadow falling over me. I could smell his breath hot and rank. "Don't rush," he said, his voice a low growl. "Stay a while. We got plenty of refreshments." The others began to rise from their booths, their movements slow and deliberate. Their parkas fell open, revealing glimpses of thick, matted fur, powerful limbs, and snouts filled with sharp teeth. They were not human. Not entirely. I stumbled back, knocking over my stool, the clatter echoing in the sudden silence. They lunged. Claws ripped at my clothes. Teeth sank into my flesh. The sweet, gamey smell became overpowering, the stench of my own blood mingling with the musky odor of the dogman. And now, here I am, pinned to the checkered floor. The cook's laughter echoing in my ears as he tears another chunk of flesh from my arm. The lights of the diner blur. The snarling faces of the dogmen swim in and out of focus. The promise of a warm meal and hot coffee had led me into a nightmare. I had walked into Dogman's diner and become the main course. Story 8. The Dalton Highway snaked ahead. A gray ribbon unraveling against the bruised purple canvas of the Alaskan twilight. My headlights barely punched through the encroaching fog, tendrils of it licking across the cracked windshield like spectral fingers. The girdered steel skeleton of the bridge loomed, a decaying monument to a bygone era, swallowing the road ahead. This bridge, they called it Muthman's Bridge. Locals whispered stories, dark tales muttered around crackling fires, about a winged harbinger of doom seen perched on its heights before tragedy struck. I scoffed, chalking it up to boreal madness, the isolation whispering to overactive imaginations. My cargo, medical equipment for a remote clinic, shifted in the back, a low groan echoing through the metal frame of the trailer. I gripped the wheel tighter, the worn leather a comfort against the encroaching chill. The bridge itself seemed to exhale, a low rumble vibrating up through the tires, into the chassis, into my very bones. A thick, greasy smell, like spoiled meat and burnt motor oil, permeated the fog. It wasn't the caribou roadkill I'd grown accustomed to. This was different, primal. And then I saw it. Perched atop the highest girder, silhouetted against the fading light, was a shape. Impossibly large, wings, vast and leathery, unfolded like a grotesque umbrella, blotting out sections of the twilight sky. It didn't move, just watched. The long neck end in a head that swiveled quick, too jerky to be natural. It fixated on me, and a wave of pure, unadulterated fear, cold and slick as ice water, washed over me. This wasn't some figment of a bored trucker's mind. This was real. This was the Mothman. The bridge groaned again, a deeper, more agonizing sound, and I slammed my foot on the accelerator. I had to get off this bridge. Now. The trailer swayed precariously behind me as I pushed the aging engine to its limits. The metal beneath me vibrated with increasing intensity, the groan morphing into a shriek. Cracks, hairline fractures at first, spider-webbed across the roadway ahead. The Mothman spread its wings further, a monstrous eclipse against the sky. It let out a sound, not a screech, not a caw, but something deeper, something that resonated not in my ears, but within the hollow spaces of my skull. A sound that tasted of decay and promised oblivion. The road beneath me buckled. I wrestled with the steering wheel, the truck swerving wildly. The world tilted. The horizon a blurred mess of gray and purple. I glimpsed the Mothman one last time, its silhouette framed by the collapsing bridge, a grotesque, satisfied smile seeming to stretch across its beakless face. Then nothing. I remember the sickening lurch as the truck plunged downwards. The roar of tearing metal. The icy grip of the river below. The world went black. Then I woke up. I was in the river. The cab was submerged, water filling my lungs, crushing my chest. I clawed at the broken window, desperate for air, for escape. My hand sliced on jagged metal, the pain barely registering. I pulled myself free, gasping for breath, the frigid water a shock against my skin. I swam towards the riverbank, towards the remnants of the collapsed bridge. The fog was thicker now, swirling and coalescing like a living entity. The grazy smell hung heavy in the air, thicker, more putrid. And then, I heard it. That sound. The resonant hum that vibrated in the marrow of my bones. I turned and saw it, standing on the shattered remnants of the bridge, silhouetted against the swirling mist. The Mothman. Its wings were gone, replaced by long, spindly arms that ended in wickedly sharp talons. Its head swiveled again, that unnatural, jerky movement, its gaze locking onto mine. It smiled. Its mouth split open in an impossibly wide grin, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth, stained black as pitch. This wasn't a harbinger. This was the architect of my destruction. This was the predator. I knew with chilling certainty that the bridge wasn't the only thing that had collapsed. My sanity, my hope, my future, it had all crumbled into the icy depths of that Alaskan river, leaving me nothing but a broken shell, a plaything for the creature that haunted the fog. The Mothman had claimed me, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that it wasn't finished yet. Story 9. The endless Alaskan highway stretched before me, a monotonous ribbon of gray against the muted landscape. I was transporting fresh produce and groceries up to Deadhorse, a job I'd taken on short notice after a string of bad luck, my bank account looking like a ghost town. I saw him standing by the side of the road, just south of Fairbanks, a scrawny figure with a backpack and a timid wave. He looked harmless enough, maybe a college kid on a walkabout. I pulled over, figuring a little company wouldn't hurt. He climbed in, mumbled a thanks, and introduced himself as Elias. He had a nervous energy about him, fidgeting constantly and avoiding eye contact. His speech was fragmented, punctuated by long, unsettling pauses. He said he was heading north to visit his sister. Where exactly? He couldn't quite recall. The first red flag, small and easily dismissed, was the smell. Not unpleasant, exactly, but medicinal. Like antiseptic and something else. Something faintly metallic. I chalked it up to the guy working in a hospital or lab. Something that explained his skittish demeanor. The conversation was stilted. He'd answer my questions with vague, rambling responses that trailed off into whispers. He kept rubbing his hands together, his knuckles bone white. A couple of hours outside of Fairbanks, Elias started talking about his work. He called it restructuring. He described it with an unnerving clinical detachment, talking about improving the human form, correcting imperfections. He pulled a small, leather-bound notebook from his backpack. Inside were intricate anatomical drawings, disturbingly detailed sketches of human bodies twisted into impossible configurations. My gut twisted with a sudden, primal fear. Fascinating, isn't it? He asked, his voice barely a breath. I forced a smile, my hand hovering near the gearshift. Yeah, sure. I managed, my voice strained. Real, interesting. He flipped through the pages, his finger tracing lines that seemed to squirm and pulse before my eyes. He pointed to one particularly grotesque illustration, a human figure with extra limbs grafted onto its torso. This one, he whispered, leaning closer, his breath hot on my ear. This one will be my masterpiece. The metallic tang in the air intensified. I could almost taste it. A coppery film coating my tongue. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird desperate for escape. I glanced at the door handle, calculating the distance, the speed, my chances of survival. He closed the notebook with a snap, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the confines of the truck. You know, he said, his voice suddenly sharp. You remind me of someone in this book. Your structure could use some improvement. He reached into his backpack, pulling out a scalpel. The blade glinted under the dim cabin lights. My blood ran cold. I slammed my foot on the accelerator. The truck lurching forward, he let out a shriek, a high-pitched, almost inhuman wail. I swerved the truck violently, hoping to throw him off balance. He lunged at me, the scalpel flashing. I blocked his arm with my forearm, a searing pain erupting as the blade sliced through my skin. I screamed, a raw, gravelly sound ripped from my throat. I fought him off, the adrenaline giving me a burst of strength I didn't know I possessed. I grabbed his arm, twisting it until he dropped the scalpel. It clattered to the floor, rolling under the passenger seat. He was stronger than he looked, his small frame surprisingly resilient. His eyes, wide and vacant, were fixed on me with a terrifying intensity. He kept muttering about crest structuring, his voice a low, guttural growl. With a final, desperate hiv, I shoved him away. He stumbled, hitting his head against the dashboard. He went limp, slumping against the door. I didn't stop. I drove for hours, the image of the scalpel, the crazed look in his eyes, burned into my memory. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing in the middle of the road, scalpel in hand, a grotesque smile splitting his face. I finally pulled over at a truck stop, shaking and covered in sweat. I checked my arm. The wound was deep, but thankfully not life-threatening. I called the police, stammering out my story. They listened patiently, but I could hear the skepticism in their voices. They promised to investigate, but I knew they thought I was just another trucker who had spent too much time on the road, another victim of the Alaskan wilderness and his own overactive imagination. I continued my drive to Deadhorse, a knot of fear tightening in my stomach with every mile. I never picked up another hitchhiker. The memory of Elias, the escaped asylum patient with a penchant for roadside surgery, stayed with me, a chilling reminder of the dark underbelly of the vast, unforgiving Alaskan landscape. And the faint, metallic smell. It seemed to linger in the cab, a constant, unsettling presence. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I would never truly escape it. Story 10. The wind howled like a banshee, clawing at my rig, pushing me further into the teeth of the blizzard. Visibility was next to nothing. I'd been foolish to take this shortcut through the Rangels, lured by the promise of saving a few hours, a few gallons of diesel. Now, I was paying the price. I gripped the wheel, knuckles bone white, my mind a frantic scramble for a solution. Then, through the swirling snow, a dim shape materialized, a cabin. Abandoned, judging by its dilapidated state, but a sanctuary nonetheless. I hauled myself out of the truck, the icy wind tearing at my parka. The snow crunched beneath my boots, a deceptively cheerful sound in this desolate landscape. The cabin door creaked open, revealing a single room, dominated by a stone fireplace, cold and empty. A moldy cot huddled in the corner. Luxury. I gathered some firewood from beneath a sagging overhang, my fingers numb despite my gloves. The fire caught quickly, dry tinder crackling and spitting, casting flickering shadows across the room. The warmth was a balm against the biting cold. I sank onto the cot, exhaustion settling deep in my bones. My name is Kevin, by the way. Always had a fascination with the old stories, the folklore of the Athabascan people, especially the chilling tales of the Wendigo. My grandmother used to tell them to me, her voice hushed, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. I never truly believed them, of course, until now. As the fire settled into a steady blaze, I heard it. A whisper, thin and reedy, barely audible over the wind. I dismissed it, attributing it to the howl of the blizzard playing tricks on my ears. But then it came again, closer this time. A sibilant murmur that seemed to come from the very walls of the cabin. Hungry. It rasped. I sat up, every muscle tense. I scanned the room, but there was nothing there. Just the flickering firelight, the dancing shadows, the oppressive silence. So hungry. The whisper repeated, laced with an unsettling desperation. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I grabbed the poker from beside the fireplace, a cold comfort in my trembling hand. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, weaving themselves into the fabric of the storm. They spoke of hunger, a gnawing, insatiable hunger that could never be quenched. They spoke of flesh, of bone, of the sweet, metallic tang of blood. They spoke of becoming something else, something monstrous. Days blurred into nights. The blizzard raged outside, trapping me in the cabin with the whispering voice. The voice that was no longer just a whisper. It was a presence. A suffocating weight pressing down on me, seeping into my thoughts, twisting my desires. The hunger started as a dull pain in my stomach. Then it grew, intensified, becoming a ravenous beast clawing at my insides. I tried to ignore it, to reason with it, but it was no use. The whispers had taken root, burrowing deep into my mind, poisoning my thoughts. I found myself staring at the fire, not seeing the flames, but envisioning the sizzling flesh of something. My own hand trembled as I raised it to my mouth, my teeth grazing my skin. The revulsion I should have felt was replaced by a perverse curiosity. The whispers urged me on, their seductive promises echoing in my ears. They told me it was the only way to survive, the only way to silence the gnawing hunger. They told me it was my destiny. One morning, I woke to an eerie silence. The blizzard had stopped. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the boarded-up windows, illuminating the cabin in a stark, unforgiving light. I looked down at my hands, caked with dried blood, the remnants of my last meal. The whispers helpfully reminded me. A wave of nausea washed over me, a fleeting glimpse of the man I once was. But the whispers quickly quelled it, soothing me with their insidious promises. They told me it was all right, that it was natural, that it was necessary. I stumbled outside, blinking in the unfamiliar light. The world was covered in a pristine blanket of snow, glittering like a million diamonds. In the distance, I saw it, my truck, my escape. But between me and the truck, something lay half buried in the snow. A shape I vaguely recognized. The whispers urged me forward, their voices a chorus of anticipation. I approached the shape, my heart pounding in my chest. As I drew closer, I saw what it was. A human figure, encased in ice, its face frozen in a silent scream. A trucker probably, caught in the blizzard just like me. The whispers intensified, their promises turning to commands. Eat, they hissed. Survive. I knelt beside the frozen body, my hand reaching out, my fingers tracing the icy contours of its face. The whispers were a crescendo in my ears, drowning out the last vestiges of my sanity. I raised my head and let out a howl, a raw, animalistic sound that echoed across the snow-covered landscape. The howl of the Wendigo. Story 11. The biting Alaskan wind howled a mournful dirge as I wrestled the 18-wheeler along the Dalton. This run to Deadhorse was supposed to be easy money, a quick in-and-out cargo haul of housing modules. The dispatcher had been unusually vague about the specifics, just a cryptic, special cargo, handle with care. He'd offered a bonus, enough to make me overlook the nagging unease. The crate itself, secured in the middle of the flabbed, was the source of my apprehension. It was massive, constructed of thick, reinforced steel, with ominous warning symbols stenciled in faded yellow paint. No windows, no ventilation grates, just solid metal. Whatever was inside, it didn't need fresh air. The blizzard hit just south of Coldfoot. Visibility dropped to near zero, the snow swirling in a blinding vortex. I gripped the wheel, my knuckles hurting, focusing on the barely perceptible taillights of the snowplow crawling ahead. Then, a sickening metallic screech ripped through the storm's roar. The truck bucked violently, throwing me against the door. "Damn it," I muttered, fearing a broken axle. I pulled over, the plow disappearing into the white chaos. The wind screamed like a banshee, the snow piling up against the truck's wheels. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously climbed out. The beam cut through the swirling snow, revealing the source of the noise, the crate. A gaping hole had been torn through the steel, jagged metal edges twisted outwards as if by immense force. The flashlight beam danced nervously around the interior of the broken crate. It was empty. My pulse quickened. Whatever had been inside was now loose in the blizzard. I scrambled back into the cab, a cold dread gripping me. This was more than just a broken cargo. This was something else entirely. Something dangerous. Hours crawled by. The blizzard finally subsided, leaving behind an eerie silence. The snowplow had long since vanished, leaving me stranded in the desolate expanse. As dawn painted the sky a sickly gray, I dared to venture out again. Footprints, large and unlike anything I'd ever seen, trailed away from the truck, disappearing into the snow-covered wilderness. They weren't human. Each print was a bizarre fusion of paw and hoof, ending in long, razor-sharp claws. I started the engine, a desperate need to put distance between me and this place consuming me. As I pulled back onto the highway, a movement in my peripheral vision made me slam on the brakes. A grotesque silhouette, barely visible against the snow-covered landscape, stood motionless near the tree line. It was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs and a head that seemed too small for its body. I could make out antler-like protrusions jutting from its head, their sharp points glinting in the weak sunlight. Terror choked me. This was no ordinary animal. This was the thing that had been in the crate. It took a slow, deliberate step towards the truck, its movements unnervingly fluid. I floored the accelerator, the tires spinning uselessly in the snow. The creature let out a deafening shriek, a sound that seemed to vibrate the very air around me, and lunged. The truck rocked violently as it slammed against the trailer, the impact throwing me against the steering wheel. Through the frosted windshield, I saw it tearing at the metal, its claws ripping through the reinforced steel as if it were paper. Adrenaline coursed through me. I shifted into reverse, ramming the truck backwards in a desperate attempt to dislodge the creature. It clung to the trailer, its shrieks echoing through the desolate landscape. Finally, with a sickening crunch of metal, it lost its grip, tumbling into the snow. I didn't wait to see if it would get up. I slammed the truck into drive and sped away, the image of the creature, its skeletal frame and glowing red eyes, burned into my mind. I drove for hours, the fear a constant companion. As I approached Deadhorse, the radio crackled to life. The dispatcher's voice, calm and reassuring, inquired about my ETA. He made no mention of the damaged crate or the escaped cargo. "Everything's fine," I lied, my voice trembling. "Just a little delay due to the weather." I delivered the housing modules, signed the paperwork, and collected my bonus. The dispatcher smiled, oblivious to the horror I had witnessed. He even offered me another run, same route, same special cargo. I shook my head, a cold sweat slicking my palms. "No thanks," I mumbled. "I think I'm done with the Dalton." I left Deadhorse, the image of the creature still haunting me. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I would never truly escape the horror of that blizzard. The Alaskan wilderness held secrets best left undisturbed, and I had stumbled upon one of its darkest. And the dispatcher, I suspected he knew more than he let on. He knew exactly what was in those crates, and he'd send another unsuspecting trucker down that road, another victim to the cryptid cargo. Story 12. The stench hit me first. Musk, decay. Something faintly sweet and wrong. I'd hauled worse, God knows. Years of runs through the Yukon and Alaska teach you not to be squeamish. But this was different. This clung to the inside of my nostrils, a grazy film I could almost taste. It started subtly south of Tok, near the Canadian border. The first carcass was a raven. Wings spread in an unnatural pose, pinned to a mile marker with what looked like thorns. Figured some kid's morbid prank. Then the foxes started appearing. Laid out in circles, their fur singed. Not scavenged, surgically removed. Again, I tried to rationalize it. Trappers, maybe. Some newfangled pest control. But the unease had taken root. A prickly feeling in my gut that refused to be ignored. By the time I reached chicken, the displays had become elaborate. A lynx, draped over a road sign, its intestines woven into a crude symbol I couldn't place. Below it, a pile of bleached bones arranged in a spiral. This wasn't the work of any trapper I knew. I stopped at the Chicken Creek Cafe, more for the company than the lukewarm coffee. The old woman behind the counter, Maggie, had seen more Alaskan winters than I'd seen sunsets. I mentioned the carcasses, trying to keep my voice light, passing it off as a weird sight. Her gaze sharpened. "Best not to dwell on things you don't understand," she said, her voice rough as bark. "This land has teeth, and it bites those who pry." She wouldn't elaborate, just shook her head and turned back to her coffee pot. I left, feeling more unsettled than before. The sun was starting its descent, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and sickly green, an unsettling backdrop to the twisted landscape. I pushed the pedal harder, wanting to reach Fairbanks before nightfall. As the light faded, the displays became more frequent, more grotesque. Wolves, bears, even a moose calf, its antlers adorned with feathers and dried berries. They were placed with a deliberate precision, a chilling artistry. Each new sight ratcheted up the dread in my stomach, a knot tightening with every mile. Just past Tetlin Junction, I saw it, a flickering orange glow in the distance off the highway. At first, I thought it was a forest fire, but as I got closer, I realized it was a bonfire, and around it, figures. Dressed in heavy parkas, their hoods obscuring their faces, they moved with an unsettling fluidity, their movements almost ritualistic. I slowed down, my heart hammering against my ribs. Curiosity, that damned, stubborn curiosity, warred with the screaming voice in my head telling me to floor it. I pulled over, telling myself I'd just take a quick look. As I approached, the stench intensified, now accompanied by the low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The figures continued their dance around the fire, their movements becoming more frenzied, their chants growing louder. Then I saw the center of their circle. A fresh kill, a caribou. Its body splayed open, its entrails spilling onto the frozen earth. The figures began smearing themselves with the blood, their chanting rising to a crescendo. This wasn't hunting. This was something else. Something ancient and terrifying. A wave of pure, visceral terror washed over me. I stumbled back, fumbling for my keys, desperate to escape. As I scrambled into the cab, one of the figures turned towards me. The firelight illuminated its face for a fleeting moment, revealing a grotesque mask carved from bone, its empty sockets seeming to stare directly into my soul. I slammed the door, the sound echoing unnaturally in the sudden silence. The engine roared to life, and I spun the truck around, tires spitting gravel. I didn't look back, didn't dare to. I drove through the night. The image of the masked figure burned into my mind. The next day, I reported what I'd seen to the state troopers. They listened patiently, but their expressions were laced with skepticism. They searched the area, but found nothing. No bonfire, no carcasses, no sign of any ritual. I knew what I'd seen, but I also knew that no one would believe me. I was just another trucker with a wild story, another victim of the vast, unforgiving Alaskan wilderness and its whispers of forgotten rituals. But the stench lingers. I can still smell it, faint but persistent, a constant reminder of the night I unknowingly drove through the hunting ground of something ancient and evil. And I know, with a chilling certainty, that I'll never truly escape the memory of those masked figures dancing in the firelight, their chants echoing in the darkest corners of my mind. Story 13. The Dalton Highway unfurls before me like a frayed nerve, vanishing into the throat of the boreal forest. Suns dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in bruised purples and sickly greens. I'm miles from anything resembling civilization, a predicament I've found myself in more times than I care to remember. Tonight, it's a forced overnight in the cab. The cargo I'm hauling too sensitive to leave unattended. I settle in, the hum of the refrigeration unit a low thrum in the quiet. The trees outside press in, dark and silent, their branches skeletal against the fading light. Then, the whispers begin. At first, I chalk it up to the wind rustling through the pines, a trick of the vast emptiness. But the wind's still. The whispers are low, sibilant, coming from all around, seeming to emanate from the trees themselves. They weave and twine, becoming words, just on the edge of comprehension. They're talking about me. A chill prickles my skin, unrelated to the dropping temperature. I pull my parka tighter, the gamey smell of the worn leather suddenly overpowering. The shadows outside deepen, shifting and coalescing into distorted shapes that dance at the edge of my vision. They're not human, not animal, but something in between. Their forms fluid, indistinct. The whispers intensify, a chorus of disembodied voices circling me, probing me. Fear, cold and sharp, grips me, a visceral terror that seeps into my bones. I lock the doors, a futile gesture against the things I'm starting to see beyond the frosted glass. Faces peer through the trees, pale and gaunt, their eyes wide, unblinking. Their mouths are open in silent screams, their lips peeled back, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. I try to rationalize it, exhaustion, isolation, a touch of cabin fever. But the reality of the situation claws at me. This isn't normal. This is something else entirely. Something ancient. Something hungry. The whispers become clearer, no longer mere murmurs, but distinct words, phrases, weaving a disturbing narrative. They speak of a realm beyond the trees, a nightmare world accessible only through this desolate patch of forest. They beckon me, their voices dripping with a cloying sweetness that turns my stomach. They promise knowledge, power, oblivion. The figures outside grow bolder, leaving the shelter of the trees, their movements unnervingly fluid. They're closer now, their faces illuminated by an unearthly glow, their features grotesque, distorted. They're not solid, not entirely real, flickering like flames in the wind, their forms constantly shifting, rearranging. I slam my hand against the horn, a desperate attempt to break the spell, to shatter the illusion. But the sound is swallowed by the forest, muffled, distorted, as if the very air is against me. The figures don't react, their silent screams intensifying, their eyes boring into me, their needle teeth glinting in the otherworldly light. The truck rocks, a slow, deliberate swaying. The refrigeration unit sputters, the low hum turning into a croaky groan. The temperature inside plummets, the air growing thick, viscous, almost impossible to breathe. The gamey smell becomes overwhelming, a stench of decay and something faintly sweet, something metallic. The figures are at the truck now, their hands, long and skeletal, pressing against the glass, leaving oily streaks. Their faces are inches from mine, their empty eyes staring into my soul. The whispers reach a fever pitch, a cacophony of voices, no longer inviting, but demanding, insistent. They're pulling me, dragging me, towards the world beyond the trees. The glass cracks, spider webbing outwards from the pressure of their hands. I scramble back, my heart pounding against my ribs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The metal of the truck groans, twisting, contorting under an unseen force. The whispers coalesce into a single voice, deep, resonant, echoing within the confines of the cab. It speaks of sacrifices, of rituals, of a gate opening, a passage to the realm beyond. The voice is ancient, powerful, filled with a malevolent joy. The glass shatters. The figures surge forward, their skeletal hands reaching, grasping, their needle teeth bared in anticipation. The world tilts. The trees above me swirling into a vortex of darkness. The whispers become a roar, consuming me, pulling me into the nightmare realm. The last thing I see is their faces. Their empty eyes burning with an unholy light, their silent screams finally becoming sound. Story 14. The polar light painted the Alaskan sky in shades of sickly green and bruised purple. I was hauling heavy machinery to Prudhoe Bay, a monotonous ribbon of highway my only companion. My GPS, usually a reliable friend, suddenly glitched, showing a shortcut I'd never seen before. Against my better judgment, I followed the phantom road, lured by the promise of shaving a few hours off my trip. The asphalt soon dissolved into dirt, the familiar spruce trees giving way to gnarled, skeletal vegetation I couldn't identify. The air grew thick with an unnatural stillness, the vibrant aurora above extinguished, as if swallowed by the encroaching gloom. The landscape twisted into something out of a fever dream. Twisted, thorny bushes scraped against my truck, the ground beneath turning a disturbing shade of ochre. Then I saw them. Figures. Huddled around a flickering fire, their forms cloaked in heavy parkas. Relief washed over me. Maybe they could point me back to the main road. As I pulled closer, an unsettling quiet settled over the scene. The figures didn't look up, their stillness unnerving. I honked, the sound echoing strangely in the distorted landscape. Finally, one figure rose, its movements jerky and unnatural. It gestured towards a path leading further into the twisted woods. Hesitation warred with a perverse curiosity. Something felt profoundly wrong. But the promise of escape spurred me onward. Following their silent guidance, I drove deeper into the heart of this alien world. The trees seemed to lean inwards, their branches clawing at the truck. The air grew heavy with a cloying sweetness, like overripe fruit rotting in the sun. I saw fleeting glimpses of movement in the shadows, quick, darting shapes that vanished before I could focus. The temperature inside my truck began to rise, despite the biting Alaskan cold outside. Then I reached a clearing. A gaping chasm split the earth, its depths concealed by swirling mist. A bridge, seemingly woven from bone and sinew, stretched precariously across the abyss. I slammed on the brakes, the truck shuddering to a halt inches from the edge. My stomach churned. I couldn't cross that. I wouldn't. The figures emerged from the surrounding woods, their parkas now open, revealing skin the color of aged parchment stretched tight over bone. Their eyes, lacking pupils, glowed with an unholy light. They began to chant, their voices a low, guttural drone that vibrated through the truck's frame. A visceral terror gripped me, cold and paralyzing. One by one, they began to shed their parkas, revealing their true forms. Their limbs were elongated, their joints bending at impossible angles. Protrusions jutted from their backs, pulsating with a sickening rhythm. Their mouths split into grotesque smiles, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. They moved towards the truck, their chanting intensifying. I fumbled for the door handle, my fingers slick with sweat. The truck was locked. I slammed my fist against the window, a futile gesture. The figures surrounded the truck, their hands, tipped with wickedly sharp talons, scraping against the metal. The chanting reached a fever pitch as they began smearing themselves with a viscous, black fluid. The smell, faintly sweet and metallic, filled the cabin. The truck rocked violently as they began to push, their combined strength surprising. The metal groaned under the pressure, the windows spider-webbing outwards. Through the cracking glass, I saw one of the figures raise a hand, its fingers tracing lines on the frosted windshield. The lines began to glow, forming symbols I instinctively understood, symbols of sacrifice, of ancient, forgotten rituals. The glass shattered, and the creatures surged forward, their claws ripping through the metal. Their faces inches from mine. Their chanting became words, gravelly whispers promising knowledge, power, oblivion. I screamed, a silent scream lost in the cacophony of their voices. They dragged me from the cab, their talons digging into my flesh. I was dragged towards the bridge of bone and sign, the chasm yawning below. The chanting intensified. A triumphant chorus as they prepared their offering to the darkness below. I looked down into the abyss, the swirling mist parting to reveal glimpses of something vast and malevolent stirring in the depths. A croaky laugh, echoing up from the chasm, was the last thing I heard before the world dissolved into darkness. Story 15. The permafrost crunched under my tires as I pulled over, the guy looking smaller than I expected against the vast Alaskan sky. He had a backpack slung over one shoulder, his face obscured by a worn baseball cap. "Heading north?" he asked, his voice surprisingly deep. I nodded, already regretting the decision. Something about his smile, a quick flash of teeth too white, too sharp, unnerved me. He introduced himself as Elias, but offered no other information. He chattered incessantly, though, filling the cab with talk of Bitcoin, encrypted messages, and the hidden corners of the internet. At first, it seemed like the usual ramblings of someone spending too much time online. Then he started mentioning the dark web. Not just the usual marketplace stuff, but the truly disturbing side. The places where the line between reality and nightmare blurred. He talked about things best left unsaid, forums dedicated to snuff films, live torture streams, and worse. He spoke casually, as if discussing the weather, a chilling detachment in his tone. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, the leather suddenly feeling cold and clammy. Ever wonder what happened to those truckers who vanished along the Dalton? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed, the question hanging in the air like ice crystals. Of course, I knew. Everyone who drove these roads knew. Truckers went missing. Sometimes their rigs were found abandoned, sometimes nothing at all. The official explanations were always vague: accidents, breakdowns, full play. But the whispers among us drivers hinted at something far more sinister. Alias's smile widened, revealing those unsettlingly sharp teeth. Let me tell you a secret, he said, leaning closer, his breath hot against my ear. They didn't just vanish. They were taken. He went on to describe elaborate rituals. Sacrifices to ancient entities dwelling in the frozen earth. He spoke of a network operating in the shadows, luring truckers to their doom. Their bodies used in grotesque ceremonies meant to appease forgotten gods. I tried to dismiss it as the ramblings of a madman, but his descriptions were too detailed, too specific. He knew things that only someone involved could know. The locations where bodies were supposedly found, the markings left behind, the cryptic messages exchanged on the dark web. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The landscape outside seemed to close in, the endless spruce forests pressing against the windows like watchful eyes. Elias continued, his voice a monotonous drone, describing the final moments of his victims. He recounted their fear, their desperation, their pleas for mercy. He lingered over the details of their deaths, his voice dripping with a perverse satisfaction. He reached into his backpack, pulling out a worn, leather-bound notebook. Want to see? He asked, holding it out to me. I shook my head, bile rising in my throat. I didn't want to see. I didn't want to know. He flipped through the pages anyway, revealing disturbingly detailed sketches. Anatomical drawings, not of normal human bodies, but of twisted, contorted forms. Limbs grafted onto torsos, extra appendages sprouting at unnatural angles. Grotesque parodies of human anatomy. He pointed to one particularly horrific illustration, a figure with elongated limbs, and a lipless mouth split into a wide, unnatural grin. This one, he said, his voice filled with a chilling amusement. This one was my favorite. My stomach lurched, the nausea rolling over me in waves. I had to get him out of the truck. I had to get away. I pulled over to the side of the road, feigning engine trouble. Something's wrong, I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. I need to check under the hood. Elias seemed unconcerned, his eyes fixated on the notebook in his lap. I stepped out of the cab, the frigid Alaskan air stinging my lungs. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I had to call for help. I had to warn someone. But as I turned back towards the truck, I saw it. A flicker of movement in the back of the cab. A shadow shifting against the frosted glass. Then, a sickening crunch, like bone grinding against bone. Followed by a silence so profound, so absolute, that it was more terrifying than any scream. I knew then, with a chilling certainty, that I wasn't going to call for help. Because the help I needed wasn't going to come. I stood there, frozen, the icy wind whipping around me, as a low, croaky growl emerged from the cab of my truck. A sound unlike anything I had ever heard before, something primal, something ancient. And as the sound intensified, I knew, with a growing horror, that Elias wasn't just a passenger. He was a harbinger. He was a gateway. He was the key that unlocked the door between our world and something far, far worse. And he had just opened it. Story 16. The Dalton Highway unwound before me, a gray ribbon cutting through the vast, ochre tapestry of the Alaskan tundra. I was hauling a load of concrete barriers south, a mundane cargo, but the money was good. Stopping at the Yukon River crossing, I decided to call it a night. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of bruised plum and sickly yellow, and a bone-chilling wind whipped across the exposed plains. I pulled off the highway, bumping along a barely perceptible track towards a sheltered hollow, figuring it a decent enough spot to park and catch some sleep. After a quick meal of lukewarm coffee and a stale sandwich, I settled into my bunk. Sleep came easily, but a persistent scratching, like nails on metal, ripped me from my slumber. It seemed to be coming from the trailer. I grabbed my mag light, heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and pulled on my boots. Outside, the world was soaked in the spectral glow of the polar light. The sight was usually breathtaking, but tonight it felt oppressive, alien. The scratching continued, insistent now, a maddening counterpoint to the whispering wind. As I cautiously approached the trailer, the metallic scent of blood, raw and pungent, hit me like a physical blow. It was a smell I recognized from my time hunting caribou, only amplified, intensified. The source of the scratching became horrifyingly clear when I swung open the rear doors of the trailer. A figure, hunched and emaciated, was tearing at the shrink wrap protecting the concrete barriers, its movements jerky and spasmodic. The figure was naked, its skin a patchwork of mottled gray and sickly yellow. It didn't turn at the sudden intrusion of light, continuing its frantic clawing. Then, with a sickening tear, it ripped a hole in the plastic and began stuffing handfuls of the shredded material into its mouth, chewing with a wet, crunching sound that sent shivers down my spine. I stumbled back, nausea rolling in my gut. This wasn't a person, it was something else, something feral. I slammed the trailer doors shut and sprinted back to the cab, fumbling for my keys. The engine roared to life, a welcome sound in this desolate, nightmarish landscape. As I pulled back onto the Dalton, I saw more figures emerge from the darkness, drawn by the sound of the engine. They were like the first, naked and gaunt, their movements disturbingly similar. They swarmed around the truck, their skeletal hands slapping against the metal sides, their hollow eyes reflecting the eerie glow of the northern lights. I floored the accelerator, the truck lurching forward, leaving them behind in a cloud of dust and exhaust. But the ordeal wasn't over. The figures, impossibly fast, began to keep pace with the truck. I could see them in my side mirrors, their forms blurred and distorted by speed, but their eyes, those vacant, reflecting eyes, burned into my memory. Over the next few hours, I drove like a man possessed, pushing the truck to its limits. The Dalton Highway, usually a monotonous stretch of gravel and permafrost, became a twisted, nightmarish track in my mind. The figures remained a constant, terrifying presence in my periphery. Near Coldfoot, desperation spurred me to try something reckless. I swerved the truck hard, aiming for a cluster of the figures. I heard the sickening thud of impact, felt the truck shudder, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Finally, as dawn broke, painting the sky in muted shades of gray and pink, the figures began to recede. They melted back in the vast, unforgiving landscape, as though they were phantoms conjured by the long, dark night. I reached Fairbanks, exhausted and shaken, the events of the night still vivid in my mind. I reported the incident to the authorities, but they found nothing. No tracks, no bodies, no evidence of the horrors I had witnessed. They dismissed it as fatigue and the tricks of the Alaskan wilderness. But I know what I saw. And I know that the next time I haul a load up the Dalton, I'll be carrying more than just cargo. I'll be carrying the chilling memory of those figures, those hollow eyes forever imprinted on my soul. The Alaskan wilderness holds its secrets close, and sometimes it's better not to know what lurks in the shadows. Story 17. The Dalton Highway unwound before me like a spool of gray yarn, disappearing into the vast Alaskan tapestry. I pulled over near a nameless peak, yearning to stretch my legs, to feel something other than the vibrating hum of the truck seat. A narrow trail, barely more than a game path, snaked upwards, promising a view. The air was thin and crisp, the silence profound. Reaching a small plateau, I saw at the fissure in the rock face, almost hidden by a curtain of stunted spruce. Curiosity, that ever-present companion of the solo traveler, pulled me forward. The opening was small, forcing me to stoop, but inside, the cave expanded into a natural amphitheater. The air grew heavy, close, like a held breath. My flashlight beam danced across the walls, revealing a gallery of ochre pictographs. They weren't the typical stylized animals I'd seen before. These were different, visceral. They pulsed with a disturbing energy. One image in particular held my gaze. A being not quite human, with limbs too long, fingers like talons, and a head that seemed both avian and reptilian. Emanating from its form were jagged lines, almost like vibrations. It was surrounded by smaller figures prostrate, seemingly offering themselves to this thing. A cold dread, like glacial meltwater, trickled down my spine. I backed away. A sudden urge to be back in the familiar metal confines of my truck. As I turned, my boot dislodged a loose rock. It clattered across the cave floor, echoing unnaturally in the oppressive quiet. And then I heard it, a low, croaky drone, almost beneath the range of hearing, yet felt as much as heard. The drone intensified, vibrating through my bones. The pictographs on the walls seemed to shift, to squirm. The air crackled with an unseen energy. I scrambled out of the cave, bursting into the fading light like a newborn, gasping for air. Back on the trail, the oppressive feeling persisted. I felt a gaze on my back, a palpable weight in the air. Glancing back, I saw nothing. Just the dark mouth of the cave, swallowed by the deepening twilight. I told myself it was the altitude, the isolation, the strange power of the pictographs working on my imagination. Reaching my truck, I slammed the door. The solid click of the lock a small comfort. As I drove, the image of the creature, etched in my mind, refused to fade. The mountains, normally majestic, now seemed to leer, their shadowed peaks like hunched shoulders watching my every move. The drone returned, a subtle vibration in the chassis, a phantom hum in my teeth. Night fell, cloaking the world in inky blackness. The headlights barely pierced the swirling snow that had begun to fall. The drone intensified, accompanied by a new sound, a faint, rhythmic clicking, like claws on metal. I checked my mirrors. Nothing, just the swirling snow and the relentless black ribbon of highway. Suddenly, a shape materialized in the passenger side mirror. Tall, gaunt, impossibly thin. It seemed to glide above the ground, its movements unnervingly fluid. Its head swiveled, and for a fleeting moment, I saw its face pale, almost translucent, with eyes that glowed with an unholy light. The clicking intensified, faster now, more frantic. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, the engine roaring in protest. The shape in the mirror vanished. Relief, fleeting and fragile, washed over me. But the drone remained, a constant thrumming presence. The clicking returned, louder now, closer. It seemed to be coming from inside the truck. I glanced at the passenger seat, empty. Then I saw it. Scratches, deep and ragged, were appearing on the dashboard as if invisible claws were tearing through the metal. The air inside the cabin grew cold, thick with a metallic scent. The drone became a deafening roar, the clicking a frantic tattoo against my skull. The truck began to shake violently, the steering wheel bucking in my hands. A shadow, vast and winged, eclipsed the headlights. The creature, impossibly large, was perched on the hood of the truck, its talons digging into the metal, its glowing eyes fixed on me, its lipless mouth split into a silent scream, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. The clicking stopped. The drone ceased. There was only the deafening roar of the wind and the creature's silent scream as the world dissolved into a swirling vortex of snow and shadow. Story 18. The fluorescent lights of the Kodiak Calf buzzed. casting a sickly yellow glow over the peeling formica tables. A stuffed Kodiak bear, one eye dangling precariously, leered from a dusty corner. It was the only other patron in the joint, aside from a woman with a disturbingly cheerful smile behind the counter, wiping it down with a rag that looked suspiciously like an old t-shirt. I was grateful for the stop, though. The haul from Anchorage to Nome was long, and the endless, snow-dusted plains were starting to play tricks on my eyes. "Coffee, Black," I told the woman, settling onto a cracked vinyl stool. My parka, stiff with ice, creaked as I moved. "Coming right up, hon," she chirped, her voice a little too high, a little too sweet. Her namatag read Darla. She poured me a cup from a dented metal pot, the steam curling around her face like a cover. "Long drive." "You have no idea," I grunted, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. The coffee was surprisingly good, rich and dark. Darla leaned against the counter, watching me with an unnerving intensity. "Heating all the way to Nome?" she asked. "Yeah," I replied, taking another sip. "Delivering these housing units. Some new mining operation up there." I gestured vaguely towards my rig parked outside, its headlights cutting twin beams into the encroaching darkness. Darla's smile widened, revealing a flash of unsettlingly sharp teeth. "Mining, huh? They dig up some strange things out there, don't they?" I shrugged. "Rocks, mostly." "Oh, I think it's more than just rocks," she said, her eyes glinting. "The earth holds secrets, you know. Ancient things, powerful things." I chalked it up to small-town eccentricity and finished my coffee. "Look, I gotta get going," I said, sliding off the stool. "Thanks for the coffee." "My pleasure, hon," Darla replied, her smile never faltering. "Safe travels." As I reached the door, I glanced back. Darla was still watching me, her expression unreadable. Back on the road, the unsettling conversation lingered in my mind. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the endless ribbon of highway stretching before me. But a strange feeling of unease remained, a prickly sensation at the back of my neck. Hours later, as I pulled over for a much-needed nap, I realized I had taken a wrong turn somewhere. The landscape was unfamiliar, the road barely more than a dirt track winding through dense, stunted trees. I cursed under my breath. My GPS was dead, and I had no cell service. Suddenly, my headlights illuminated a small, wooden sign half hidden amongst the trees. A Kodiak Caf and 5 miles. It was impossible. I had driven for hours. How could I be back near that diner? I considered turning around, my gut screaming at me to get out of there. But the thought of another night navigating those desolate roads alone was almost as terrifying. Against my better judgment, I drove on. The diner, soaked in an eerie glow, looked exactly the same. Darla, wearing the same stained apron, greeted me with the same unsettlingly cheerful smile. "Welcome back, hon. Decided you weren't quite ready to leave." A cold dread washed over me. "I think I made a wrong turn," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "Oh, I think you found exactly where you were meant to be," Darla replied, her voice now devoid of its previous sweetness. She gestured towards a booth in the back, the same one where the stuffed Kodiak bear had been perched earlier. The bear was gone. In its place sat a man, his eyes vacant, his skin a disturbing shade of gray. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. What is this?" "Dinner," Darla hissed, her face contorting into a snarl. The man in the booth let out a low, gravelly growl, his eyes fixed on me with a predatory hunger. I turned and ran, scrambling for the door. But Darla was faster. She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. Her nails, long and sharp, dug into my flesh. "Where do you think you're going, hon?" she whispered, her voice dripping with malice. "You're the main course." The other patrons, their faces pale and gaunt, began to emerge from the shadows. They moved with an unnerving slowness, their eyes burning with an unholy light. They were all dressed in parkas, their hoods pulled low, obscuring their features. I struggled against Darla's grip, but it was no use. She dragged me towards the back of the diner, towards a heavy metal door I hadn't noticed before. As she pushed me through the door, I caught a glimpse of the room beyond. A chilling collection of tools hung on the wall, gleaming under a single bare bulb. The air was thick with the coppery tang of blood. The floor was stained a dark, almost black color. And in the center of the room, on a blood-soaked table, lay the stuffed Kodiak bear, its disemboweled body splayed open, its one remaining eye staring blankly at the ceiling. Darla shoved me towards the table. The other patrons closed in, their silent whispers filling the room. I knew, with a sickening certainty, that this was the end. The earth held secrets, all right, and I had just stumbled upon one of its darkest. My delivery to Nome would never arrive. The factory-made housing units were destined for a different purpose, a far more sinister construction project. They would become the walls of my tome. Another addition to Darla's gruesome Kodiak cave. Story 19. The Alaskan interior stretched out before me, a vast canvas of ochre and umber under a bruised purple sky. Hauling large mining equipment to Prudhoe Bay was a monotonous job, but it paid well. I was halfway through my shift, the hum of the tires a lullaby against the whispering wind, when I saw it. A flicker of movement in the rearview mirror, too large to be a moose, too fluid to be a bear. I dismissed it as a trick of the light, a phantom conjured by the isolation. An hour later, a low thrumming vibration began to resonate through the cab, the steering wheel trembling beneath my hands. I glanced at the gauges, but everything looked normal. The vibration intensified, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic clicking, almost like pebbles being tossed against the undercarriage. A quick check in the mirrors revealed nothing, just the endless ribbon of highway unwinding behind me, swallowed by the encroaching twilight. The clicking grew louder, insistent, and the thrumming became a guttural drone that seemed to burrow into my skull. My apprehension ratcheted up a notch. Then, a massive, hairy form lumbered out of the trees lining the highway, keeping pace with the truck. It was easily 7 feet tall, its silhouette impossibly broad against the fading light. A Bigfoot. The creature pounded on the side of the trailer, a deafening boom that echoed through the cab. The truck swerved violently, and I fought to regain control. This was no curious observer. This was a territorial display, a warning. My truck, my livelihood, had become an intrusion. The Bigfoot bellowed, a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard, a primal roar that vibrated through the very ground beneath the tires. It accelerated, its gait unnervingly smooth, its massive hand reaching out, clawing at the metal. The trailer rocked precariously as it tore off chunks of the mining equipment machinery, tossing it aside like a discarded toy. Panic tightened its icy grip around my chest. I floored it, the engine screaming in protest, but the Bigfoot kept pace. The clicking intensified. A frantic tattoo against the metal, and I realized with growing horror that more were joining the chase. Dark shapes emerged from the trees, their eyes glowing with a feral light. Their roars a terrifying chorus. My mirrors showed a terrifying tableau, a pack of Bigfoot, their fury unleashed, intent on dismantling my rig, piece by piece. I glanced at the fuel gauge. A cold knot forming in my stomach. I wasn't going to outrun them. I needed a plan, a way to level the playing field. Up ahead, the highway snaked precariously close to a deep ravine. A desperate gamble formed in my mind. As I approached the curve, I yanked the steering wheel hard, the truck's tires screaming in protest as it skidded towards the edge. The Bigfoot behind me, caught off guard, stumbled and roared in frustration. I straightened the wheel just in time, the tires spitting gravel as the truck regained traction. Looking back, I saw one of the creatures teetering on the precipice, its massive arms windmilling as it struggled to maintain its balance. With a final, earth-shattering roar, it tumbled into the abyss, its form swallowed by the darkness. The others paused, their fury momentarily checked by the sight of their fallen comrade. I seized the opportunity, slamming my foot down on the accelerator. putting as much distance as possible between myself and the remaining Bigfoot. The drone of their roars faded behind me, replaced by the pounding of my own heart. I didn't stop driving until I reached Deadhorse, the lights of the oil refinery a welcome sight. I pulled into the first truck stop I could find, my hands still shaking uncontrollably. The attendant, a grizzled veteran of the Alaskan trucking scene, looked at my battered rig, his expression unreadable. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice roughened by years of cold and cigarettes. I just nodded, unable to articulate the nightmare I had just escaped. He gestured towards a dented, rusting coffee machine in the corner. "Strong stuff. Might help calm your nerves." I poured myself a cup, the bitter liquid burning a welcome path down my throat. As I sipped, I looked out the window at the vast, unforgiving Alaskan wilderness. I knew with a chilling certainty that I had crossed into something sacred, violated some ancient territory. And the Bigfoot, I suspected, would not forgive trespassers easily. The clicking had stopped, but the thrumming remained, a constant, unsettling presence, a reminder of the horrors that lurked just beyond the thin veneer of civilization. Story 20. The wind howled like a banshee, whipping snow against my rig, turning the Alaskan wilderness into a blinding white maelstrom. I'd pushed my luck too far, trying to make anchorage before the storm hit. Now, stuck on a barely there track off the Stees Highway, I knew I had to find shelter fast. A flicker of yellow caught my eye, the faint glow of a cabin window through the swirling snow. I pulled off the track, my tires crunching over frozen brush, grateful for even this dilapidated sanctuary. The cabin was small, a single-story structure hunkered down against the elements. A rusted metal chimney pipe jutted from the roof, a wisp of smoke defying the gale. I trudged through the knee-deep snow, my boots heavy with the accumulating ice. Inside, a meager fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting flickering shadows that danced on the log walls. The single room was sparsely furnished, a cracked vinyl sofa, a rickety wooden table, and a rusted cast iron stove. The air was thick with the scent of pine and something else, something subtly off. A faint, coppery tang that prickled my nostrils. A framed map of Alaska hung on the wall, marked with a network of handwritten notes and strange symbols I couldn't decipher. Pins, topped with tiny, hand-carved wooden skulls, clustered in one particular area near Denali. An unsettling detail, but I was too cold and tired to dwell on it. I grabbed a moth-eaten blanket from the sofa and huddled closer to the fire, my damp clothes steaming in the warmth. As the blizzard raged outside, I noticed a stack of old journals on the table. Bound in leather and worn with age, they seemed to hum with a strange energy. Curiosity overriding my exhaustion, I reached for the topmost journal. The leather felt oddly smooth, almost fleshy. The journal's yellowed pages chronicled the life of a man named James, a trapper who'd lived in the cabin decades ago. His entries were initially mundane, descriptions of trapping routes, the weather, the solitude. But as I read on, a chilling transformation took place. James's writing became erratic, filled with feverish ramblings about a voice in the wind and a gift from the ice. He described elaborate rituals involving animal bones and a sacred circle in the woods. The final entry sent a shiver down my spine. It spoke of a final, terrifying communion with the voice, a merging of flesh and spirit, a transcendence beyond human comprehension. The last line simply read, "The ice has claimed me." I slammed the journal shut, a knot forming in my stomach. The coppery smell seemed stronger now, almost overpowering. The wind howled outside, and for a moment, I could have sworn I heard a faint whisper echoing James's final words. Suddenly, the cabin door burst open, and a figure stood silhouetted against the swirling snow. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in tattered furs, his face hidden by a deep hood. He moved with an unnerving fluidity, almost gliding across the floor towards me. My heart pounded in my chest, fear clawing at my throat. I scrambled backwards, reaching for anything I could use as a weapon. My hand landed on a heavy iron poker leaning against the hearth. The figure stopped a few feet away, his hooded head tilted as if studying me. He raised a hand and, with a slow, deliberate movement, pushed back the hood. The face beneath was unnatural. Skin stretched taut over bone, almost translucent, revealing the intricate network of veins beneath. Eyes, black and devoid of pupils, stared at me with a chilling intensity. A lipless mouth split into a wide, grotesque smile, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. He spoke, his voice a raspy whisper that seemed to slither into my mind. "The ice has gifts to share," he hissed, reaching out a skeletal hand towards me. "Become one with the cold." I lunged forward, the iron poker heavy in my grip. But the figure moved with impossible speed, dodging my blow and grabbing my wrist with a strength that belied his frail appearance. His icy grip tightened, the bones in my hand grinding together. His smile widened, his black eyes boring into mine. "The ice hungers," he whispered, his breath cold against my cheek. "And it has chosen you." I screamed, a primal sound of terror that was swallowed by the howling wind. His grip tightened further, my bones cracking under the pressure. The world around me began to blur, the cabin walls dissolving into a swirling vortex of white. The icy cold seeped into my veins, numbing my body, stealing my breath. I felt a sharp, excruciating pain as something pierced my skin, something cold and sharp, like shards of ice. My vision faded, replaced by the chilling blackness of the Arctic night. The last thing I saw was the figure's grotesque smile, a triumphant grin as the ice claimed me, just as it had claimed James before me. Story 21. The ice glistened like a million fractured diamonds under the weak Alaskan sun. Hauling heating supplies up north was monotonous, but the pay was good. I needed the money. My daughter Lily needed surgery, and the insurance company was being difficult. So, I drove. I pulled over at a scenic overlook, something I rarely did. Lily loved glaciers, and I'd promised her pictures. This particular glacier was retreating, a dirty, melting wound on the mountainside. A strange, ochre tapestry stained the exposed ice, a network of lines and symbols I couldn't understand. Curiosity overriding better judgment, I clambered down for a closer look. That's when I saw it. Embedded in the melting ice, a body. Not animal, human. Or what had been human. The ice had preserved it, but the thawing process had begun, revealing skin a sickly green-gray. Something squirmed beneath the surface of the skin, something moving. Then the ice around the body cracked, releasing a coppery stench, thick and sweet. A dark, viscous fluid oozed from the newly exposed cavity in the chest. Within the fluid, a worm, pulsing with a life I couldn't comprehend. My stomach lurched, but a morbid fascination held me rooted. I reached out, my gloved hand hovering over the pulsing worm. I wanted to touch it, understand it. Later, I'd tell myself exhaustion, the stress of Lily's upcoming surgery, the solitude of the Alaskan wilderness. Something had to explain why I did what I did next. I touched it. The worm recoiled at my touch, then, with unsettling speed, latched onto my finger. A searing pain like molten metal shot up my arm. I ripped it away, a piece of my glove, and I suspected, a piece of my finger still attached to the squirming creature. Panic set in. I scrambled back to the truck, scrubbing frantically at my hand with snow. The wound, small and dark, continued to burn. I told myself it was nothing, just a bite, just a bad dream. But the dream wouldn't end. The burning spread, a constant, agonizing thrumming beneath my skin. My appetite vanished, replaced by a gnawing hunger, a craving for something I couldn't name. My reflection started to change, subtle at first, then more pronounced. My skin took on a grayish tinge. The ochre symbols I'd seen on the glacier began appearing on my own skin, intricate patterns spreading like a disease. I tried to rationalize it. Infection. Altitude sickness. Anything but the truth whispering at the edge of my sanity. The truth that I was changing, becoming something else. something not human. The changes became more drastic. My joints burned, bending at unnatural angles. My fingers elongated, tipped with claws that tore through my gloves. The hunger intensified, a primal urge overwhelming any sense of reason. One night, parked at a desolate rest stop, I saw a family huddled around a campfire. They were laughing, sharing stories. Normal, happy. The sight filled me with a rage I couldn't explain. The hunger screamed, a desperate need to consume, to absorb. I tried to fight it. I slammed my head against the steering wheel, clawing at my changing flesh. But the creature inside was winning. I remember staggering from the truck, my movements jerky and uncontrolled. I remember the family's screams as I approached, their laughter turning to terror. I remember the metallic tang of blood, the sickening crunch of bone. I remember very little after that. Flashes of violence, fleeting images of carnage. The ochre symbols on my skin pulsed with an unholy light, guiding me, driving me. I was a predator, unleashed upon the Alaskan wilderness. I don't know how long the feeding frenzy lasted. Days, weeks. Time lost all meaning. I was lost, a creature of instinct, driven by the parasite that now controlled my body and soul. Then, one cold, clear night, I looked up at the polar light painting the sky in vibrant hues. A flicker of humanity, a spark of recognition, surfaced in the monstrous abyss of my mind. I saw Lily's face, her bright smile, the hope in her eyes. The creature inside roared, a primal scream of rage at this intrusion. But for the first time, I fought back. I clawed at the ochre symbols on my skin, tearing at the flesh that no longer felt like my own. It was a battle for my soul, a desperate struggle against the parasite that held me captive. The pain was excruciating, a fire burning through my very being. But I held on to the image of Lily, her face a beacon in the encroaching darkness. Then, silence. The burning subsided. The hunger receded. I collapsed onto the frozen ground, my body racked with tremors. I looked at my hands. Human again. But the ochre symbols remained, faint scars, a permanent reminder of the horror I had become. The memories, the carnage, I could never erase them. I made it to the hospital just in time for Lily's surgery. I held her hand, whispering stories of the beautiful glaciers, careful to omit the monster I had become. The surgery was successful. Lily was going to be okay, but I knew I would never be. The creature within was dormant, perhaps, but not gone. The ochre symbols on my skin were a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked within, waiting to be unleashed. I was a monster in remission, a ticking time bomb, forever trapped in the frozen fear of what I might become again. And I knew, with chilling certainty, that the Alaskan wilderness would never let me forget. Story 22. The Prudhoe Bay sun, a week. Watery thing even in July, glinted off the endless coils of pipe I was hauling. Factory-made sections, destined for the newest stretch of the Trans-Alaskan pipeline expansion. A good contract. Even if it meant weeks navigating the Dalton Highway, a teeth-rattling beast masquerading as a road. Elias, my dispatcher, had been oddly evasive when I'd asked about the specific route. Just stick to the marked path, he'd mumbled, his voice a strange mix of casual and urgent. There's been some delays. Just get the pipes where they need to be. The delays became apparent on day 3. I found myself diverted onto a freshly carved track, barely wider than my rig, snaking through a valley I'd never seen marked on any map. No signage, no other vehicles, just the relentless hum of my engine and the oppressive quiet of the Alaskan wilderness. That's when the whispers started. At first, I dismissed it as fatigue. The long hours, the monotonous drone of the engine, the sheer isolation, it can mess with your head. But the whispers persisted, growing louder, more distinct, weaving themselves into a chilling chorus. They spoke of cold, of darkness, of metal-tearing flesh, and of the pipeline. One evening, I pulled over near a frozen creek. The whispers intensified, swirling around me like icy wind. I saw them then, flickering in my peripheral vision, shadowy figures, hunched and spectral. their forms shifting and indistinct. They seemed to emanate from the pipeline itself, their whispers clinging to the cold metal like frost. Driven by a morbid curiosity, or perhaps a budding madness, I cautiously approached the pipeline. The whispers intensified, becoming words, fragmented phrases. Not again, cold steel, never finished. I touched the pipe. It was icy cold, almost vibrating with an unsettling energy. And then I saw it. Etched into the metal, barely visible under the gathering gloom, were ochre symbols. Unlike anything I'd ever seen before, they seemed to squirm and shift, like insects trapped beneath ice. As I watched, horrified, the symbols began to glow with an unnatural, pulsing light. The whispers became screams. The shadowy figures surged towards me, their forms coalescing into something inhuman. Their limbs twisted at impossible angles, their faces pale and gaunt, eyes burning with a cold, otherworldly fire. I scrambled back to my truck, heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I fumbled with the ignition, the engine roaring to life just as the figures reached the truck. They slammed against the metal, their skeletal hands leaving no marks, but their silent screams echoing through the cab, filling it with a bone-chilling dread. I drove through the night, ignoring the treacherous track, the whispers dogging my every mile. I kept seeing those symbols in my mind's eye, burning against the darkness. The next day, I reached the designated drop-off point. A small, desolate plateau, where a section of the pipeline lay waiting to be connected. The whispers had subsided, but the oppressive feeling remained. As I watched the crane lower my cargo into place, I saw the workers, their faces drawn and pale, their eyes darting nervously towards the surrounding wilderness. One of them, a grizzled veteran with a weathered face, caught my eye. He gestured towards the pipeline, his voice barely a rasp. "Be careful out here, son," he warned. "This land, it remembers." I nodded, a chill running down my spine. I didn't need to be told, I knew. The land remembered, and the pipeline whispered its secrets to those who dared to listen. I hit the gas, desperate to put as much distance as possible between myself and that haunted valley. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And every time I glanced in my rearview mirror, I could almost see them, the shadowy figures, flickering in the periphery, their silent screams a constant, chilling reminder of the phantom pipeline and the secrets it held. Story 23. The Dalton Highway unfurls before me, a gray ribbon against the ochre tapestry of the Alaskan fall. I'm hauling factory-made housing modules up to Prudhoe Bay, a job I took on short notice. Something about the quick cash and the solitude appealed to me. Solitude, that's what I craved. Little did I know this stretch of road, a place called the Alaskan Triangle, would offer anything but. The change started subtly. The landscape twisted, the familiar stunted spruce becoming grotesque parodies of trees, their branches skeletal against a sky that seemed to gain color, a sickly yellow. My GPS glitched, showing me driving across frozen lakes, then soaring through the air. I dismissed it as a malfunction, a product of the extreme cold, but the unease remained. A prickly sensation at the back of my neck. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, like the wind sighing through the stunted trees, they quickly coalesced into distinct words. Fragmented phrases about ancient rituals and forgotten gods. I cranked the heater, trying to dispel the growing chill, telling myself it was just the wind. The vast emptiness of the Alaskan interior playing tricks on my mind. Near Tetlin Junction, I saw it. A flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, silhouetted against the dying light. I blinked, and it was gone. Just a trick of the light, I reasoned. But the whispers intensified, a chorus of voices now, urging me further north. Promising knowledge, promising something. The time distortions grew worse. Hours bled into minutes, minutes stretched into what felt like days. I lost track of how long I'd been driving. The sun seemed to set and rise multiple times in a single hour. The landscape outside became a blur of distorted shapes, the trees bending at impossible angles. Then, the foxes. Scores of them. Their eyes glowing with an unnatural light, lining the highway, watching me. Their silence was more disturbing than any howl could have been. They seemed to be guiding me, herding me like some unwitting sheep towards an unknown destination. I pulled over, desperate for a break. My hands trembled as I reached for my thermos, spilling lukewarm coffee across the cracked vinyl dashboard. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. My face was gaunt, my eyes wide and bloodshot. I looked like a man who had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back. As I sat there, the whispers became clearer, forming sentences, telling me of a place. A hidden valley where the veil between worlds is thin. A place of power, they called it. They promised me answers, understanding. They promised me transcendence. My hesitation warred with a perverse curiosity. A desperate gamble formed in my mind. I would drive to this valley, see for myself what these whispers promised. Maybe I was going crazy. Maybe this was all in my head. But a part of me, a deep, primal part, believed. I drove on, following a freshly carved track leading off the main highway. The whispers guided me, leading me deeper into the heart of the Alaskan Triangle. The track wound through dense, stunted trees, the air growing heavy with a cloying sweetness, like overripe fruit rotting. The foxes followed, their glowing eyes a constant escort in the deepening twilight. The track ended at a small plateau. In the center stood a circle of standing stones, ancient and weathered, their surfaces covered in ochre pictographs. The foxes formed a ring around the stones, their eyes fixed on me. The whispers intensified, becoming a rhythmic chant, a guttural drone that vibrated through the very ground beneath me. In the center of the stone circle, a shimmering portal opened, swirling with colors I had never seen before. The whispers urged me forward, promising knowledge beyond human comprehension. My body moved involuntarily, drawn towards the pulsating light. Terror and a strange sense of anticipation warred within me. I stepped into the portal. The world dissolved. I found myself in a vast, cavernous space, illuminated by an unholy light. Grotesque figures, their bodies twisted into impossible configurations, danced around me, their chanting reaching a fever pitch. The air was thick with the coppery stench of blood. This was the valley, the place of power. And I was the offering. They surged towards me, their skeletal hands reaching, their mouths split in grotesque smiles. The whispers became screams, a terrifying chorus of welcome. This was the end. This was transcendence. This was the heart of the Alaskan Triangle, and I was lost within it. Story 24. The permafrost groaned beneath the tires of my Kenworth, a low, croaky sound that echoed the unease in my gut. I was transporting geothermal probes up the Dalton, a job I'd taken on short notice, lured by the promise of a hefty paycheck. My dispatcher, a woman named Emily, had been unusually vague about the cargo's final destination, some research outpost north of Deadhorse. She'd mentioned needing a driver with a strong stomach and a quiet mind. At the time, I chuckled, assuming it was some kind of morbid Alaskan humor. Now, I wasn't so sure. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, leaving behind a twilight that painted the snow-covered foothills a bruised lavender. The cab of my truck, usually a welcome sanctuary, felt increasingly claustrophobic. The heater was blasting, but a creeping chill seemed to emanate from the steel walls themselves. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me, some shadowy behemoth keeping pace with my rig. There was nothing, of course, just the endless, desolate highway unwinding behind me. But the feeling persisted. It started subtly a flicker in my peripheral vision, a faint metallic tang in the air. Then the whispers began. Not through the CB, which was blessedly silent, but inside my head, a sibilant chorus of voices, too quiet to decipher, yet loud enough to fray my nerves. They seemed to emanate from the cargo itself, a low, rhythmic drone that vibrated through the floorboards. I tried to rationalize it. Cabin fever, I told myself. Sleep deprivation playing tricks on my mind. But the whispers intensified, weaving themselves into fragmented phrases, something about forgotten rituals, something about a hunger that needed to be fed. At mile marker 211, I saw it. A figure standing by the side of the road, covered in a dark parka. Its face was hidden by a thick hood, but I could feel its gaze, a palpable weight that made my skin crawl. I slowed down, instinctively reaching for my thermos of coffee, a futile attempt to steady my trembling hands. As I drew closer, the figure raised a hand, a silent plea for help. Hesitation warred with a stubborn curiosity. This far north, leaving someone stranded was a death sentence. I pulled over, the brakes sighing in protest. The figure approached the truck, its movements unnervingly fluid. As it reached the passenger door, it stopped, its head tilting slightly, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. I rolled down the window, a blast of frigid air stinging my face. "Need a lift?" I managed. My voice strained. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly reached up and pulled back its hood, revealing a face that was both human and horrifyingly not. Its skin was a sickly gray, stretched taut over sharp cheekbones. Its eyes, wide and unblinking, lacked pupils. And its mouth, oh God, its mouth was split in a grotesque, perpetual smile, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. A gravelly growl emerged from its throat, a sound that seemed to resonate deep within my bones. Then, the whispers in my head intensified, becoming a deafening chorus of voices, urging me to open the door, to let it in. My hand, as if possessed, reached for the door handle. Suddenly, a high-pitched whine filled the air. The figure recoiled, its head snapping back towards the source of the sound. I followed its gaze and saw a small, unmanned drone hovering above us, its camera lens glinting in the twilight. It was a security drone, part of the pipeline's surveillance system. Its presence, however fleeting, seemed to disrupt whatever hold the creature had over me. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires spitting gravel as I pulled away, leaving the figure standing by the side of the road, its silent scream echoing in my ears. I didn't look back, not until I reached Dead Horse, the oil rigs looming like skeletal giants against the twilight sky. I delivered my cargo, my hands still shaking uncontrollably. Emily, my dispatcher, seemed unconcerned by my disheveled appearance and frantic ramblings. "Rough night?" she asked, a disturbingly cheerful smile on her face. I mumbled something about bad weather, eager to escape her presence. As I drove south, back towards Fairbanks, the whispers returned, fainter now, but still there, a constant reminder of the horror I had encountered. I knew I would never truly escape it, that the ice road stalker would forever haunt the desolate corners of my mind. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I was not the first, nor would I be the last, to fall victim to its insidious lure. Story 25. The Dalton Highway unfurls before me, a black ribbon against the muted ochre of the Alaskan fall. The sun dips below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and sickly greens. The polar light shimmers above, a ghostly curtain against the encroaching twilight. I'm hauling a load of factory-made housing units up to Prudhoe Bay, a job I took on short notice for a hefty paycheck. I should have known better than to be on the road this late in the season. The silence inside the cab is broken by a faint, rhythmic clicking coming from somewhere behind me. I check my mirrors, half expecting to see some lost soul trying to hitch a ride. But the highway behind is empty. The clicking continues, a steady, unnerving pulse. It sounds almost metallic, like pebbles being tossed against the steel walls of the trailer. A shiver crawls down my spine. I crank up the heater, trying to dispel the sudden chill that settled in the cab. The northern lights above intensifies, its shimmering display becoming increasingly frenetic. The colors pulsate and swirl, a mesmerizing, yet unsettling spectacle. The clicking intensifies, too, becoming a frantic tattoo against the metal. I glance nervously in my mirror again. Still nothing. Familiar landmarks appear distorted, the stunted spruce trees taking on grotesque, almost human shapes. Suddenly, a high-pitched whine fills the cab, an electronic shriek that makes my teeth burn. The dashboard lights flicker erratically, then die. The truck lurches violently, throwing me against the steering wheel. I fight to regain control, my hands slick with sweat. The whine ceases as abruptly as it began, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The clicking stops too. I pull over to the side of the highway, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sudden quiet feels more threatening than the noise. I grab my flashlight and climb out of the cab, the biting Alaskan air stinging my face. The northern lights continues its silent dance above, illuminating a scene that makes my stomach churn. Surrounding the truck are dozens of shapes, dark and still against the snow-covered ground. They appear to be animals, foxes, or even a lone grizzly bear, but something is terribly wrong. Their limbs are twisted at unnatural angles. Their bodies grotesquely elongated. Their eyes, reflecting the eerie light of the northern lights, glow with an unnatural, feral luminescence. A low growl rumbles from the grizzly, a sound that seems to vibrate through the very ground beneath my feet. It takes a step towards me, its movements jerky and unnatural. The other animals follow, their silence more terrifying than any roar. I scramble back into the cab, slamming the door shut. The locks click into place with a sound that seems deafening in the sudden quiet. The creatures surround the truck, their forms casting grotesque shadows against the frosted glass. I can hear their claws scraping against the metal, a chilling counterpoint to the now familiar clicking sound. I try the engine, but it's dead. The radio is silent, the CB useless. I'm trapped. The creatures begin to circle the truck, their movements becoming a disturbingly synchronized dance. Their growls and snarls coalesce into a rhythmic chant, a gravelly drone that seems to resonate within my skull. The northern lights above pulses in time with their chant, bathing the scene in a pulsating, unholy light. One of the foxes leaps onto the hood of the truck, its distorted face inches from the windshield. Its eyes, glowing with an eerie green light, seem to bore into me. It opens its mouth, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. A faint, sickly sweet smell wafts into the cab, a smell I recognize from a childhood hunting trip with my grandfather, the metallic tang of blood. The fox begins to claw at the windshield, its talons leaving long, deep scratches in the glass. The other creatures join in, their claws ripping through the metal sides of the truck, their snarling faces pressed against the windows. I cower in the driver's seat, my hands covering my ears, trying to block out the horrifying sounds of tearing metal and shattering glass. The cabin is filling with the sickly sweet smell, growing stronger with each passing moment. The chanting intensifies, becoming a deafening chorus that seems to vibrate through my very being. The aurora above reaches a terrifying crescendo, its colors swirling and pulsing with an almost unbearable intensity. The creatures outside become a frenzy of teeth and claws, their forms blurring into a grotesque, squirming mass. The truck rocks violently, the metal groaning under their combined assault. Then, with a sickening lurch, the truck begins to tilt. I see a gaping chasm opening up in the frozen earth beneath us, a black abyss swallowing the snow and the squirming creatures. The truck plunges downwards, the last thing I see being the swirling vortex of the aurora, pulling me down into an endless, terrifying darkness. The chanting becomes a triumphant chorus, echoing in my ears as the world dissolves around me. Story 26. The flashing blue and red strobed across the endless white expanse, a jarring interruption to the muted ochre of the Alaskan tundra. I checked my speed, well under the limit. Must be a random check. I pulled over, the snow crunching beneath my tires. A trooper emerged, his form strangely elongated, almost fluid in the shimmering twilight. He gestured for me to roll down my window. As I did, a peculiar high-pitched whine filled the cabin, like feedback from an untuned radio. The trooper leaned in, his face obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. "License and registration, please." His voice was strangely thin, almost a whisper against the wind. Something about his presence felt off. I handed over my documents. He took them, his gloved hand strangely cold against mine. He retreated back to his patrol car, the whine intensifying. I watched him through my rearview mirror, a strange unease settling in my gut. He seemed to be studying my license intently, his head cocked at an unnatural angle. The whine grew louder, morphing into a rhythmic pulse that seemed to vibrate through the truck itself. Then, the patrol car's lights went out. The whine ceased abruptly, replaced by an unnerving silence. I waited, my hand hovering over the ignition. Minutes crawled by. Finally, I pulled my parka tighter around me and stepped out into the biting cold. "Officer," I called out, my voice swallowed by the vastness. No response. I cautiously approached the patrol car. The driver's side door was ajar. I peered inside. Empty. The keys were still in the ignition, dangling precariously. My unease morphed into full-blown anxiety. Then I saw it. Scrawled across the dashboard in what looked like dried blood, a single word: "Follow." My breath hitched in my throat. This was no ordinary traffic stop. This was something else. I backed away from the car, my heart hammering against my ribs. I wanted to run, to jump back in my truck and drive as far away from this place as possible. But something held me back. A morbid curiosity. A need to understand what was happening. I glanced back at the words scrawled across the dashboard. "Follow." Follow what? Where? My eyes scanned the desolate landscape. Nothing. Just endless snow and the darkening sky. Then, a flicker of movement in the distance. A faint, pulsating light. It was moving slowly at first, then gaining speed. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. It looked like the patrol car. But it was gliding, not driving, hovering just above the snow-covered ground. A low, croaky drone emanated from it, the same sound I had heard earlier, only deeper, more resonant. It was heading north, away from the highway, towards the vast, unexplored wilderness. And it seemed to be waiting for me. Against my better judgment, I climbed back into my truck. My hands trembled as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered to life, a fragile sound against the growing drone. I put the truck in gear and slowly started to follow the ghostly patrol car, the snow crunching beneath my tires, a morbid rhythm against the pulsating drone. The phantom patrol car led me off the highway and onto a barely perceptible track, winding through the dense spruce forest. The trees seemed to press in on me, their branches skeletal against the increasingly dark sky. The drone intensified, vibrating through the truck, through my very bones. The track led me upwards, climbing steadily towards a small plateau covered in mist. As I reached the summit, the drone reached a fever pitch, and the patrol car vanished. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt. Before me lay a sight that would forever be seared into my memory. A vast, circular clearing in the forest. In the center stood a stone circle, ancient and weathered. Surrounding the circle were figures, dozens of them, cloaked in dark parkas, their faces obscured by shadows. They were chanting, a low, rhythmic drone that echoed through the valley. And in the center of the circle, drenched in an eerie green light, lay me. Another me, lying motionless on the ground, my eyes wide open, staring blankly up at the sky. The figures continued their chant, their voices growing louder, their words becoming clearer. They were speaking in a language I didn't understand, but I instinctively knew what they were saying. They were reciting a ritual, a sacrifice, and I was the offering. The figures began to move towards the center of the circle, their movements unnervingly fluid, their forms shifting and blurring in the flickering green light. They reached me, the other me, and their hands, skeletal and clawed, reached out, my vision blurred. The drone intensified, becoming a deafening roar. The world tilted, the trees swirling around me, the figures dissolving into shadows. And then, darkness. I woke up in my truck, back on the highway. The sun was rising, painting the snow-covered landscape in soft hues of pink and orange. I checked my mirrors. No patrol car, no track, no plateau, nothing. It had all been a dream, a nightmare. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. It had been so real, so vivid, but it was over. I was safe. Then I saw it. Scrawled across my dashboard, in what looked like dried blood, a single word. Again. The high-pitched whine started again, low at first, then steadily building in intensity. I looked in my rearview mirror. In the distance, a flicker of blue and red. A patrol car, emerging from the shimmering dawn, its lights strobing, beckoning me forward. And as the whine intensified, morphing into a pulsating drone, I knew, with a chilling certainty, that this nightmare was far from over. Story 27. The ivory keys gleamed under the dim cabin light. My grandpappy John, bless his soul, had insisted I take his old upright along on my first solo haul. He'd claimed it, soothed the savage Alaskan breast. John had vanished near Prudhoe Bay 5 years back. They never found him or his rig. Just his battered, ivory-keyed piano, abandoned by the side of the Dalton. Now, the piano sat bolted to the floor of my trailer, a constant, ivory grinning reminder of the man I'd never truly known. I played a hesitant chord. The sound was surprisingly pure, a stark contrast to the groaning behemoth, pulling me further into the Alaskan interior. This delivery, equipment for a new mining operation near Deadhorse, meant everything. A chance to finally break free from the endless cycle of debt that had plagued my family since John disappeared. Tetlin Junction. A quick stop for coffee and some much-needed human interaction. I hadn't seen another vehicle for hours. Inside the diner, a bushman sat hunched over a bowl of chili. He didn't look up as I entered, but a low, rhythmic clicking began emanating from somewhere beneath his heavy parka. It wasn't quite mechanical, not quite organic, just unsettling. He gestured vaguely towards a faded map on the wall, tracing a route I'd never seen. "Quicker this way," he rasped, his voice surprisingly melodic. "Avoids the pipeline construction. Saves you a day, maybe two." His finger stopped at a blank spot on the map, a place devoid of any markings. The route was tempting. But something held me back. Something about the way his eyes, barely visible under the shadow of his hood, seemed to bore into me. Something about the clicking. I mumbled something about sticking to the Dalton and paid for my lukewarm coffee. As I climbed back into the cab, the clicking stopped. The uneasiness remained. Hours passed. The Dalton Highway stretched before me, a black ribbon unraveling against the muted ochre of the Alaskan landscape. The sky, a bruised lavender, hinted at the approaching twilight. I played a melancholic melody on the piano, trying to soothe my frayed nerves. Then it started. A faint, rhythmic thump, almost beneath the sound of the tires against the gravel. It resonated through the floor of the cab, a maddening counterpoint to the ivory keys. I checked the mirrors. Nothing, just the empty highway stretching behind me. The thumping intensified, becoming a steady pulse that vibrated through the steering wheel. The cab seemed to grow colder, a biting chill seeping through the insulated walls. And then, the whispers. Faint at first, barely discernible over the thrumming vibration, they seemed to emanate from the piano itself. Fragmentary words, slithering into my consciousness. They spoke of a place, a hidden valley where ancient entities dwelled. They promised knowledge, power, transcendence beyond human comprehension. The truck began to swerve, pulling towards the right. I wrestled with the steering wheel, my knuckles white against the worn leather. I slammed on the brakes, but they felt spongy, unresponsive. The truck lurched off the highway, tires spitting gravel as it plunged into the dense spruce forest. The piano's melody twisted into a cacophony of discordant notes, the ivory keys dancing under an unseen force. The whispers intensified, becoming clearer, more insistent. They were pulling me towards that blank spot on the map, towards the heart of the valley. They told me I was chosen, that I was meant to join them. The truck bucked violently, throwing me against the dashboard. I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. Figures. Tall, gaunt figures with impossibly long limbs, their bodies smeared with a viscous, almost black fluid. Their faces, obscured by hoods, were turned towards me, their empty sockets seeming to burn with an unholy light. The thumping reached a fever pitch. The whispers became screams, echoing through the cabin, through my skull. The steering wheel trembled violently beneath my grasp, spinning wildly as the truck careened through the undergrowth. I slammed my fist against the ivory keys, a desperate, futile gesture against the rising tide of madness. The sound was swallowed by the screams, by the relentless thrumming of the earth beneath me. The truck plunged downwards, the ground disappearing beneath the wheels. I saw the valley then, a natural amphitheater ringed by jagged peaks that glowed at the bruised purple sky. The figures were there, waiting. They surrounded the truck, their skeletal hands reaching, their lipless mouths split in grotesque smiles. The piano's ivory grin seemed to widen, mocking my terror. The whispers coalesced into a single voice, echoing the promise of knowledge, the promise of oblivion. I closed my eyes, the icy grip of fear squeezing the air from my lungs. I knew, with chilling certainty, that I would never leave this valley, that I was destined to become another addition to the ochre tapestry, stained forever with the secrets of the Alaskan wilderness. The ivory keys, gleaming under the unnatural light, played their final, triumphant chorus. Story 28. The Dalton Highway unfurls before me, a gray ribbon against the muted ochre of the Alaskan fall. I'm moving a load of factory-made housing units up to Prudhoe Bay, a job I took on short notice. The money's good, but the solitude weighs heavy. It's the kind of job that breeds stories, ghost stories, monster stories, stories about the things that watch you from the endless spruce forests pressing in on either side. My thoughts are interrupted by a faint, rhythmic clicking coming from the dash. I fiddle with the dial, thinking it's interference, but the clicking persists, growing steadily louder, accompanied by a low, resonant thrum that seems to vibrate through the floor of the cab. Then, a voice thin and reedy breaks through the static. "John, can you hear me, John? We're lost, the stones, they're moving." The voice fades in and out, swallowed by the static. It sounds ancient, brittle, desperate. My hand hovers over the CB, a flicker of unease in my gut. This isn't the usual trucker chatter. This sounds different. I try to raise the source, but the signal's too weak. The only response is more static and that unsettling rhythmic clicking. "Stones, moving," the voice whispers again, just before the signal dies completely. I shake my head, attributing it to a faulty transmission, a trick of the vast Alaskan wilderness. Still, something about the desperation in that voice nags at me. John, it's an old-timer's name, a name that belongs to a prospector, not some kid chasing the oil boom. And stones, what stones? A few miles down the road, I see it. A barely perceptible track leading off the highway, barely wider than a game trail. Normally, I wouldn't give it a second thought, but the voice, that plea for help, pulls me off the Dalton. The track winds through dense spruce, the branches scraping against the sides of my truck. The clicking returns, stronger now, almost deafening. The thrumming vibrates through the seat. I try to rationalize it a faulty alternator, maybe, but the growing dread in my stomach tells a different story. The trees thin, revealing a small plateau covered in an unnatural twilight. In the center stands a circle of impossibly smooth, black stones, each one taller than a man. And in the middle of the circle, a figure. He's hunched over, bundled in a thick parka, his back to me. "John." I call out, my voice echoing strangely in the unnatural quiet. The figure slowly turns, and my blood runs cold. It's not a man, not anymore. Its face is stretched and pale, its eyes huge and empty, lacking pupils. Its limbs are abnormally long and thin, its joints bending at impossible angles. It raises a hand towards me, its fingers elongated, almost skeletal. And the clicking, it's coming from it. From inside it. A rhythmic, sickening sound that seems to burrow into my brain. I slam the truck into reverse, the tires spinning uselessly in the soft earth. The creature, if that's what it is, glides towards me with unnerving speed, its movements disturbingly fluid. It's then I notice the other figures emerging from the trees, all sharing the same grotesque features. Their eyes vacant, their mouths split in silent screams. They're all moving towards me. Their clicking and thrumming coalescing into a terrifying chorus. I manage to wrench the wheel, the truck fishtailing wildly as I tear back down the narrow track. Branches whipping against the windshield. The creatures pursue, their silent screams echoing through the trees. I burst back onto the Dalton, the familiar metal confines of the cab a small comfort. I floor it heading north, the desolate highway unwinding behind me. The clicking fades, the thrumming subsides. I glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those grotesque forms pursuing me. But there's nothing there, just the empty highway stretching into the Alaskan twilight. I reach Deadhorse hours later, the experience a raw, visceral terror I can't shake. I deliver my cargo, the other truckers looking at me strangely. My disheveled appearance and frantic ramblings about stones and clicking things, eliciting uneasy laughter. Later, huddled in my bunk, I try to convince myself it was a hallucination, a trick of sleep deprivation and the vast, isolating landscape. But the memory of that plateau, of those vacant eyes and elongated limbs, remains burned into my mind. Days turn into weeks. The memory slowly fading, replaced by the monotony of the road. Then, one night, I'm back on the Dalton, hauling another load north. I'm approaching the same stretch of highway where I saw the track. The radio crackles to life. "John, can you hear me, John?" The voice is weak, almost lost in the static. "The stones, they call to us. We offer ourselves willingly now." The rhythmic clicking starts again, soft at first, then steadily louder. The steering wheel trembles beneath my white knuckles. I glance nervously towards the place where the track disappears into the trees, the growing dread in my stomach telling me everything I need to know. I know I should keep driving, put as much distance as possible between myself and that place, but I can't. Something pulls me towards it, a morbid fascination, a need to understand the horror I witnessed. I slow the truck, my foot hovering over the brake. The clicking intensifies, the thrumming vibrating through the floor of the cab. The voice on the radio whispers again, closer now, almost in my ear. "John, join us, become stone." I pull off the highway, the tires crunching on the gravel as I turn onto the track. The darkness of the trees swallows me whole. Story 29. The click started softly, almost like thawing ice cracking in the spring. I dismissed it, figuring it was just the shifting load of greenhouse sections I was hauling up to Prudhoe Bay. Up here, sounds played tricks on you. The endless white expanse, the whispering wind, the sheer isolation, it all brewed a certain solitary madness. I'd seen it in other drivers, heard it in their rambling stories at truck stops. I prided myself on being immune. I was a scientist at heart, a geologist before trucking claimed me. Rocks and dirt, they told the truth. They didn't lie. The clicking intensified, becoming a rhythmic, almost organic pulse. It emanated from the back of the trailer, not mechanical, definitely organic. This time, I couldn't dismiss it. My cargo was hydroponic equipment, inert, sterile. Nothing back there should be clicking. I pulled over, the silence profound once the truck's engine died. The clicking continued, a frantic, maddening counterpoint to the otherwise silent landscape. Unease morphed into full-blown anxiety. I grabbed the maglite and hopped out, the frigid Alaskan air biting at my exposed skin. The trailer doors seemed to pulse with the clicking. I hesitated, hand on the cold metal handle. This was stupid. Probably just some Arctic rodent that had snuck in at the last stop. Still, I yanked the doors open, the sudden intrusion of light startling me as much as whatever lurked within. At first, I saw nothing. Just the neatly stacked greenhouse frames, gleaming under the maglight's beam. Then, the clicking intensified, and the light caught something. Movement. Something small, dark, and disturbingly numerous. Insects. Thousands of them. Black. Chitinous, with impossibly long, segmented bodies and legs too numerous to count. They swarmed over the greenhouse frames, their clicking mandibles working in unison. Their segmented bodies pulsed with a sickly yellow bioluminescence, illuminating the inside of the trailer in an eerie, pulsating glow. They weren't anything I'd ever seen. Not even in my geology textbooks. They looked ancient, prehistoric. As if sensing my presence, the swarm shifted. The clicking reached a fever pitch, and the insects began to pour out of the trailer, a black tide flowing towards me. I stumbled backward, dropping the maglight. The beam danced wildly across the snow, momentarily blinding me. Panic choked me. I scrambled back into the cab, slamming the door shut. The truck rocked as the insects hit it, a solid wave of chitinous bodies crashing against the metal. The clicking became a deafening chorus, a terrifying symphony of hunger. I hit the locks, heart hammering against my ribs. The dome light illuminated the cab, and to my horror, I saw more insects, smaller ones, already inside. They poured from the ventilation grates above, dropping onto the dashboard, the seats crawling over my hands. They were different from the larger ones, smaller, almost ant-like, but with the same unsettling yellow glow. They moved with unnerving speed, their tiny mandibles clicking. They weren't biting, not yet. They were exploring, testing. I brushed them off frantically, scrubbing at my skin. They felt strangely oily, leaving a faint, sickly sweet residue. The larger insects continued their assault on the outside of the truck, their combined weight rocking the vehicle. The metal groaned under their assault, the sound echoing unnervingly in the confined space. Then, the biting started. Sharp, pinprick sensations at first, quickly escalating to searing pain as the smaller insects swarmed over me, their mandibles tearing at my exposed skin. I slapped at them, crushed them under my boots. But there were too many. The cab became a living nightmare. The air thick with the clicking of mandibles, the sickly sweet smell intensifying, becoming almost cloying. The larger insects outside continued their relentless assault, the metal of the truck groaning under their weight. The windows began to spider web, hairline fractures spreading across the glass. I knew, with chilling certainty, that this was the end. The permafrost had given up its secrets, and I was paying the price. My scientific curiosity, my pride and my rationality, had led me here, to this desolate patch of the Alaskan wilderness, where ancient horrors stirred and I would become their next meal. The windshield finally gave way, shattering inwards in a shower of glass. The larger insects poured in, a black, chittering tide. Their yellow bioluminescence filled the cab, casting grotesque shadows against the remaining windows. Their clicking mandibles worked in a terrifyingly synchronized rhythm, the sound echoing the frantic beat of my dying heart. The smaller insects swarmed over me, a living blanket of chitin and clicking mandibles. The pain became a dull roar, a visceral terror that consumed me as I felt myself being eaten alive. A sacrifice to the creeping permafrost and the ancient horrors it unleashed. The clicking intensified, a triumphant chorus as the world dissolved around me. The last thing I saw the sickly yellow glow of their bodies. The last thing I heard the relentless clicking of their mandibles. A chilling reminder of the secrets the frozen earth holds, and the price of disturbing them. Story 30. My great-aunt Tilly always said I inherited her gift. Not the gift of gab or the gift of crocheting intricate doilies. No. Tilly's gift was seeing things others couldn't, sensing the subtle shift in the fabric of reality, the whispers just beyond the range of human hearing. I always dismissed it as eccentric old age. Until tonight, I'd picked up the hitchhiker just outside of talk. He was young, maybe early 20s, with a worn backpack and a nervous smile. He introduced himself as Ely, and we fell into easy conversation about the mundane, the price of diesel, the best fishing spots. Ely seemed particularly interested in my cargo. Greenhouse panels destined for a hydroponic farm up north. He asked questions about the construction, the materials, the intended use. I found his inquisitiveness a little odd, but harmless enough. As we approached the turnoff for chicken, a strange static filled the cab. It wasn't coming from the CB, but seemed to emanate from Ely himself. He stopped talking mid-sentence, his smile faltering. His eyes, which had been a normal hazel, now shone with an unsettling, almost metallic gold. Then, his skin began to ripple. Not like a shiver, but more like a disturbed pond. The surface agitated by something unseen beneath. The flesh under his eyes tightened, pulling back from his teeth in a ghastly grin that stretched impossibly wide. His fingers elongated, the nails sharpening into wickedly curved talons. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding on the gravel. Ellie, or whatever he was, let out a low, croaky chuckle that vibrated the very metal of the cab. He no longer resembled a man. The creature before me was a grotesque parody of humanity, its skin a sickly yellow-green, its limbs too long, too thin. It reached for me, its talons clicking against the dashboard. I fumbled for the tire iron under my seat, adrenaline flooding my veins. Aunt Tilly's whispers, once dismissed as ramblings, now echoed in my mind. The land remembers. It holds things best left undisturbed. I suddenly understood. This wasn't just some escaped lunatic. This was something ancient. Something tied to this land in ways I couldn't comprehend. I swung the tire iron, connecting with its shoulder. It recoiled with a hissing shriek, more insect than human. The creature scrambled back, its golden eyes burning with predatory intent. I lunged for the door handle, scrambling out into the biting Alaska night. I ran. I didn't know where, just away. The creature's shrieks echoed behind me, spurred by a rage that seemed to warp the air itself. I stumbled through the scrub, the thorny branches tearing at my clothes. I could hear it gaining on me, its clicking talons a terrifying counterpoint to the pounding of my heart. I scrambled up a rocky outcrop, desperate for a vantage point. Below me, covered in the eerie glow of the creature's golden eyes, I saw shapes. Not trees, not animals, but figures. Humanoid, but elongated, their skin the same sickly yellow-green. They were emerging from the forest, drawn by the creature's shrieks, their movements unnervingly synchronized. They carried strange implements, bone and metal woven together in grotesque, ritualistic designs. The creature, now standing at the base of the outcrop, gestured towards me, its lipless mouth splitting further in a silent command. The figures began to chant, a low, croaky drone that resonated deep within my bones. I knew with a terrifying certainty that I was witnessing something ancient, something unholy. They weren't just hunting me. They were preparing a ceremony. I had to get out of there. I had to warn someone. But who would believe me? Who would believe that beneath the veneer of this vast, untamed wilderness, something ancient and malevolent stirred? I saw my truck below, abandoned but still running. A desperate gamble formed in my mind. I scrambled down the other side of the outcrop, hoping to circle back and reach the road. But as I ran, I saw the figures fanning out, their golden eyes reflecting the starlight, their chant growing louder, closer. I reached the road, fumbling with the truck's door handle. Just as I slipped inside, a hand slammed against the window. The creature's face, inches from mine, its golden eyes burning into my soul. I turned the key, the engine roaring to life. I slammed the truck into reverse, tires spitting gravel, and floored the accelerator. The last thing I saw in the rearview mirror, as I sped away, was the circle of figures, covered in the unnatural golden glow. They weren't chasing me anymore. They were standing there, chanting, their long, thin arms raised towards the sky. They were offering me, or perhaps something more, to whatever lurked in the heart of this ancient land. I drove until dawn, the terrifying image seared into my memory. I never picked up another hitchhiker. I never spoke about what I saw that night. but the whispers are still there, just beyond the range of human hearing. A chilling reminder of what lurks beneath the surface of this beautiful, terrifying land. Aunt Tilly's gift, once a source of amusement, is now a constant, gnawing fear. I see the shapes in the shadows, hear the chanting in the wind, and I know with a sickening certainty that the land remembers. And it hasn't forgotten me. Story 31. The Brooks Range loomed, a jagged maw against the bruised twilight. This far north, the Dalton Highway was less a road, more a suggestion scratched across the unforgiving permafrost. My cargo, factory-made hydroponic greenhouses destined for a research station near Proto Bay, shifted with a metallic groan, a constant reminder of the precarious balance between me and the abyss. I was already pushing my luck, this late in the season. First snowfall was just a breath away. The heater sputtered a pathetic attempt at warmth. Losing the battle against the seeping Arctic chill, I swiped at the condensation on the window, revealing the tundra, a vast, undulating carpet of ochre and gray. Then, I saw them. At first, I thought they were caribou. Dark shapes against the fading light. But caribou don't move like that. These figures, dozens of them, flowed across the landscape, almost gliding. They weren't walking, not running, but something in between, their movements disturbingly fluid. They kept pace with the truck, a silent, spectral train flanking my descent into the Arctic night. Eunice tightened its icy grip. I pressed the accelerator, the engine whining its protest against the biting cold and the demanding incline. The figures remained alongside, their pace unnervingly matched to mine. They were herding me, leading me. Leading me where? The first flakes began to fall, delicate whispers against the windshield quickly transforming into a swirling white maelstrom. Visibility plummeted. The hypnotic rhythm of the wipers, the groan of the engine, and the growing panic inside the cabin became my only reality. Then the road vanished. Or rather, it diverged. A faint track, barely discernible through the blizzard, branched off from the Dalton, leading towards nothing I could see but swirling white. The figures on the tundra had coalesced, forming a dark, beckoning arrow pointing down this phantom road. Hesitation warred with a strange compulsion. This was insane. No sane trucker would leave the Dalton in a blizzard. But the figures, they promised something. A warmth, a sanctuary from the biting cold and the encroaching madness of the isolating wilderness. Their silent promise echoed the growing desperation within me. I gripped the steering wheel, took a deep breath, and turned. The truck bucked, tires spitting gravel as I wrestled it onto the barely there track. The Dalton, my lifeline to the world, vanished behind the swirling curtain of snow. The shadowy figures seemed to approve, their silent dance quickening, becoming almost frenetic. The track wound through a labyrinth of frozen scrub, leading steadily upward onto a small, windswept plateau. The blizzard thinned, revealing a sight that stole the breath from my lungs. A valley, hidden amongst the jagged peaks, covered in an unnatural, pulsing light. Structures, not unlike my greenhouse modules, but far larger, stood in a perfect circle, emitting a soft, inviting glow. This was their destination, their sanctuary. Mine, too, it seemed. As I drove closer, the figures on the tundra dissolved into the swirling snow, their purpose fulfilled. The pulsing light intensified, bathing the valley in a sickly yellow luminescence. The structures weren't greenhouses, not exactly. They were organic, almost flesh-like, pulsing with veins of light. And they hummed, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the truck through me. The truck rolled to a stop at the entrance to the circle. The humming intensified, resonating deep within my bones. A hatch opened in the nearest structure, revealing a swirling vortex of the same unsettling yellow light it beckoned. It promised. I knew, with terrifying certainty, that stepping out of the truck meant crossing a threshold, leaving the world I knew, stepping into something other. The promise of warmth, of sanctuary, had curdled into something else. A terrible understanding. This wasn't a refuge from the blizzard, it was a trap. But the humming, it pulled at me, a physical force resonating deep within my being. My hand moved involuntarily towards the door handle, a puppet on invisible strings. The promise had become a command. My last clear memory is of the door clicking open, the rush of warm, gamey air, the humming filling my ears, and a final, chilling whisper echoing through the valley, promising knowledge beyond human comprehension. A promise I now understood was a death sentence. A sentence I walked willingly into, lured by shadows and the siren song of the tundra. Story 32. My grandpappy Silas always told me, "Boy, Alaska ain't got no room for folks who can't appreciate the quiet." He meant it too. He'd spent his life trapping up near the Brooks Range, a place so quiet the silence itself could drive a man mad. He wasn't wrong. Silence can be a powerful, unsettling thing. But Henry, he loved it, he craved it. Me, I'm a talker. I need noise. Chatter, the murmur of a crowd. That's why I took to trucking. The endless miles, sure, but also the chatter on the CB, the friendly faces at the truck stops, the stories shared over bad coffee. Anything to break the quiet. This run, though, was testing even my tolerance for solitude. I was hauling a load of factory-made saunas down to Seward, a strange cargo for this far north. They were oddly ornate, carved with symbols I couldn't quite place, all swirling lines and strange faces. The guy at the loading dock just shrugged when I asked about them. "Some rich fella's fancy," he'd said, handing me the paperwork with a wink. "Just get 'em there in one piece." A few 100 miles out of Prudhoe Bay, just past Coldfoot, I saw it a roadside stall selling native crafts. I pulled over, needing a break, needing to talk to someone, anyone. The vendor, a skinny Athabascan woman with eyes as sharp as glacial ice, sat bundled in a thick parka. I browsed the dream catchers and beaded necklaces, my eyes drawn to a towering totem pole tucked in the back corner. It was unlike any I'd seen, carved from dark, almost black wood, the figures twisted and grotesque, their mouths open in silent screams. "That one," I blurted out, surprising myself. "How much?" The woman's eyes narrowed. "That one not for sale," she said, her voice raspy. "I'll pay double whatever you're asking," I insisted, the quiet of the road already creeping back into my bones. She hesitated. Then a slow smile spread across her face. $500, she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And you don't ask no questions." I handed over the cash, helped her load the totem onto the flab, and strapped it down next to the saunas. As I pulled back onto the Dalton, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The woman was gone. The stall, the crafts, everything vanished. Just the empty stretch of road and the darkening sky. That's when the whispers started. Soft at first, like the rustling of leaves in a non-existent breeze. Barely audible over the hum of the engine. They grew steadily louder, weaving themselves into fragmented phrases, words I couldn't quite grasp. They seemed to emanate from the totem pole, twisting around me, filling the cab with an unnatural presence. My hands started sweating. The temperature in the cab dropped drastically, despite the heater blasting. Then, the foxes. First one. Then two. Then a whole pack, their eyes glowing with an unsettling yellow luminescence, running alongside the truck, keeping pace with me. Their silent gaze fixed on the totem. They seemed to multiply with every mile, a silent, spectral escort. I tried the CB, desperate for a human voice to drown out the whispers, but all I got was static, interspersed with bursts of distorted, croaky sounds that mirrored the whispers in the cab. The landscape outside began to warp and twist. Familiar landmarks seemed distorted, the mountains closing in, the trees taking on grotesque shapes, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The saunas, too, seemed to shift and squirm under their canvas covers, their carved faces twisting into mocking grins. The whispers intensified, swirling around me, becoming almost unbearable, a chorus of voices vying for my attention. I pulled over, heart pounding, the foxes encircling the truck, their eyes burning into me. I fumbled for my phone, no signal. I tried the CB again, nothing but static and guttural growls. I was alone. Utterly and terrifyingly alone. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the totem pole was the source of this madness. I had to get rid of it. I scrambled out of the cab, grabbed a crowbar from the toolbox, and approached the flabbed, the foxes parting silently to let me pass. The whispers intensified, becoming almost screams, as I began to pry the totem loose. As the last strap came undone, the ground beneath me trembled. The foxes howled, a chilling, mournful dirge. The saunas on the flatbed began to shake violently, the canvas covers ripping open, revealing not the ornate wooden structures I had loaded, but squirming, pulsating masses of flesh, intertwined with carved bone and sinew. Their surfaces covered in the same swirling symbols as the totem. The figures on the totem itself seemed to come alive, their mouths opening wider, their silent screams finally becoming sound. A deafening chorus of pure, unadulterated terror. I dropped the crowbar and stumbled back, my mind reeling, the whispers, the foxes, the grotesque cargo, all merging into a single, overwhelming wave of horror. The world tilted, the ground beneath my feet dissolving into a swirling vortex of black. I remember a flash of yellow, the foxes leaping onto the flabbed, tearing at the fleshy mounds, their snarls joining the chorus of screams. I remember the totem pole falling, the ground cracking open beneath it, swallowing it whole. Then, darkness. I woke up in a hospital bed in Fairbanks, 3 days later. The doctors told me I was lucky to be alive, that a trooper found me wandering along the Dalton, rambling incoherently about foxes and whispers. They said I'd suffered from exposure and dehydration, probably a touch of hypothermia. They never found my truck or the cargo. The silence in the hospital room was almost unbearable. I craved noise, chatter, anything to break the quiet. But underneath it all, I could still hear them. The whispers, faint but still there, a constant, chilling reminder of the totem pole and the terrible secret it unleashed. Grandpappy Henry was right. Alaska ain't got no room for folks who can't appreciate the quiet. And now, I understand why. Story 33. The sun. It never sets. It just hangs there, a malevolent eye staring, judging. Day 23 of this run up to Prudhoe Bay, and I swear it's burrowed into my skull. Bleached my thoughts bone white. Sleep's a faded memory, a luxury I can no longer afford. The Dalton Highway unwinds before me, a gray ribbon against the muted ochre of the tundra. And I grip the wheel, knuckles raw, fighting the urge to just stop. To close my eyes, even for a second. But I can't. Something keeps me moving. It started subtly. A flicker in my peripheral vision, like heat rising off the asphalt. Then, the whispering. Soft at first, almost a sigh carried on the non-existent breeze. I chalked it up to fatigue, the endless drone of the engine, the monotony of the landscape. But it grew, became words. Fragmented, disjointed, yet somehow familiar. They spoke of the sun, its power, its hunger. They promised understanding. The whispers intensified, weaving themselves into a tapestry of sound, a constant murmur dogging my every mile. They talked about the old ones, the beings who dwell beneath the permafrost, beings awakened by the relentless sun. They spoke of rituals, of sacrifice, of becoming one with the light. Then came the foxes. Dozens of them, their fur an unnatural, vibrant orange. They appeared on the horizon, small flickers of movement against the vastness. They followed me, their eyes gleaming with a predatory intelligence. They never approached too closely, always maintaining a respectful distance, their silent observation more unsettling than any outright aggression. The world began to warp, to twist. Familiar landmarks appeared distorted, alien. The stunted spruce trees, usually a comforting presence in this barren landscape, now seemed to squirm and contort, their branches reaching towards me like skeletal fingers. The landscape outside my window transformed into a grotesque parody of itself, the muted colors pulsating with an unseen energy. The foxes multiplied. Hundreds now, perhaps thousands. They lined the highway, a silent, watchful audience. Their orange fur seemed to absorb the relentless sunlight, radiating an unsettling warmth. Their eyes, those intelligent, predatory eyes, bored into me, judging my every move. The whispers became a chorus, a deafening cacophony inside my head. They spoke of a place, a valley hidden deep within the brook's range. They described a circle of standing stones, coated in the unnatural light of the midnight sun. They promised knowledge, power, release. I found myself driving towards the brook's range, an invisible force guiding my hand. The Dalton Highway, my trusted companion for so many miles, now seemed like a pathway to oblivion. I no longer recognized myself in the cracked reflection of the rearview mirror. My eyes were wide, bloodshot, pupils dilated. My skin was stretched taut across my cheekbones, almost translucent under the relentless sun. I had become a vessel, an empty shell driven by an alien will. I pulled off the highway, following a barely perceptible track winding through dense spruce. The foxes parted silently, creating a path for me. The air grew heavy, thick with an almost cloying sweetness. The whispers intensified, becoming a single, unified voice, guiding me towards my destination. The track ended at a small plateau covered in mist. In the center stood a circle of ancient, moss-covered stones, soaked in the eerie glow of the midnight sun. The foxes surrounded me, their orange fur radiating an unnatural heat. Their eyes, now burning with a feverish intensity, watched me with an unsettling mixture of anticipation and hunger. The whispers urged me forward, promising enlightenment, transcendence. I stepped into the circle, the ground beneath my feet surprisingly warm. The air shimmered, and the world around me began to dissolve. The foxes closed in, their bodies pressing against mine, their warmth seeping into my skin. The whispers became a chant, a rhythmic pulse resonating deep within my bones. I felt a strange energy coursing through my veins, a power both terrifying and exhilarating. The sun, the malevolent eye that had haunted me for so long, now seemed welcoming. I raised my arms towards the sky, embracing the light, the warmth, the madness. The foxes surged forward, their orange fur merging with the pulsating glow of the standing stones. The world dissolved around me, replaced by a blinding white maelstrom, the whispers becoming a triumphant chorus, welcoming me into the embrace of the old ones. The midnight sun had claimed another victim. Story 34. The salt spray stung my face as I wrestled the 18-wheeler along the ice-choked Alaskan coast, delivering tents to some eco-resort in the north, a job as strange as any I'd taken. But the money was good. I should have flown, I thought, but the thought of another cramped puddle jumper sent shivers down my spine. The shivers weren't entirely from the cold. The sun, a pale disk in the pewter sky, offered little warmth. The icy wind howled a mournful dirge, rattling the yurt frames stacked in the trailer like giant dice. Up ahead, the frozen Bering Sea stretched as far as the eye could see, a landscape of jagged white and bruised gray. Then I saw it. Initially, I thought it was a pressure ridge, a trick of the light. But as I drew closer, the shape solidified into something wrong. A ship, a three-masted sailing vessel, trapped in the ice. But not like any ship I'd ever seen. Its sails were tattered covers, frozen stiff. The hull was encased in thick ice, rimed with frost that glittered unnaturally in the weak sunlight. And there was something off about its angle, listing precariously as if about to capsize, but eternally frozen in that moment of impending doom. As I slowed, a strange humming filled the cab, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the floorboards and into my bones. The hair on my arms prickled. This wasn't right. This was bad. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run. But a morbid curiosity, that peculiar Alaskan affliction, kept me moving forward. I pulled over a safe distance away, the hum intensifying, the air inside the cab suddenly frigid. I grabbed my binoculars, my hand trembling. Through the lenses, the details of the ship became horrifyingly clear. The ice encasing the vessel wasn't just ice. It was fused with the ship, with the figures on deck. Figures. They stood frozen, their faces contorted in silent screams, their bodies encased in a grotesque parody of winter clothing. Their hands, twisted into claws, stretched towards me as if pleading, or perhaps threatening. One figure, near the helm, held something. It glinted in the weak sunlight. It looked like a brass telescope, but abnormally long, almost impossibly thin. Then the humming intensified, becoming a low, rhythmic drone that seemed to penetrate my skull. The figures on deck began to move, infinitesimally at first, a twitching of frozen limbs, a slow turning of frosted heads. Then faster, their movements were jerky, unnatural. Their eyes, visible through the ice, locked onto me. And then they started to sing. It wasn't singing, not really. More like a low, guttural chant, a mournful wail that echoed across the desolate ice. The words were unintelligible, yet I understood their meaning. Desperation, rage, and a profound, bone-chilling cold. I fumbled for the ignition, my heart hammering against my ribs. The truck wouldn't start. The humming grew louder, drowning out the wind. The figures on the deck were now moving with terrifying speed, their frozen limbs flailing, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams. The one at the helm raised the long, thin telescope. It wasn't pointed at me. It was pointed at the ice beneath my truck. The ice cracked. A deep fissure snaked across the frozen sea, heading straight for me. The truck tilted precariously. I remember screaming. Then I saw it, a single object lying on the ice near the ship. A small, intricately carved wooden box, inlaid with walrus ivory. It was a puzzle box, the kind the old Athabascan shamans used. My grandfather had one just like it. He'd told me stories about them, about their power, about the things they could hold. He'd warned me never to touch one. The truck plunged into the icy water, the frigid depths closing over me. The last thing I saw was the puzzle box, bobbing on the surface, the intricate carvings seeming to squirm and shift in the fading light. The last thing I heard was the chanting, no longer mournful, but triumphant, echoing across the desolate, icy expanse. The chanting is still there sometimes, in my dreams, and sometimes when the wind howls and the ice groans, I see them. The frozen crew, their faces contorted in silent screams, their eyes burning with a cold, eternal rage, and the puzzle box, always the puzzle box. A chilling reminder of the day I stumbled upon the frozen ghost ship and became another victim of its icy revenge. Story 35. The faded sign creak, its rusted hinges protesting against the wind that howled down from the Chugach Mountains. Shoshana Gulch, population 0.0. Right. I should have known better than to take this supposed shortcut, some forgotten miner's trail etched into the mountainside. But deadlines, man, deadlines. 30 plasma TVs had to be in Valdez by morning, and the main highway was closed due to an avalanche. Emma, my dispatcher, swore this route would shave hours off my trip. Emma was also a compulsive liar. Shoshana Gulch was a ghost town. More than a ghost town, it felt wrong. The buildings, weathered and skeletal, leaned precariously against each other like drunken mourners. The silence was thick, suffocating, broken only by the mournful groan of the wind. I cut the engine. The sudden cessation of the low rumble feeling unnatural in the oppressive quiet. A flicker of movement in my peripheral vision drew my eye. A figure, stooped and disguised in shadow, moved between two buildings. Then another, and another. They seemed to glide, their feet never quite touching the ground. A knees prickled at the back of my neck. I told myself it was the wind playing tricks with the shadows, the long hours on the road messing with my head. I grabbed my thermos, needing the familiar comfort of lukewarm coffee. As I unscrewed the lid, a high-pitched, keening wail echoed through the valley. It was a sound of pure anguish, of suffering beyond comprehension. My hand trembled, spilling coffee down my sleeve. I looked up, my eyes scanning the dilapidated buildings. The figures were still there, more of them now, materializing from the shadows. They wore what looked like tattered mining clothes, their faces obscured by the gloom. They began to move towards the center of the town, their movements slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic. The keening wail intensified, joined by a chorus of whispers, too low to decipher, yet somehow filling the valley. It felt like the ground itself was whispering, the very air vibrating with an unseen energy. The figures converged around what looked like a crude stone well. One by one, they began to descend into the darkness below. Curiosity, or perhaps a morbid fascination, drew me towards the well. The whispers grew louder as I approached, coalescing into fragmented phrases. Trapped. Darkness. Never again. I peered over the edge. The well was deep, impossibly deep, a black abyss swallowing the last vestiges of light. A wave of dizziness washed over me, the smell of damp earth and something vaguely metallic rising from the depths. Suddenly, a hand shot out of the darkness, grabbing my ankle. I cried out, stumbling back, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked down. The hand was gone. Hallucination. It had to be. Then the ground began to tremble. The whispers intensified, becoming screams of pure terror. The figures reappeared from the well, their faces now visible in the flickering light of a newly risen moon. Their eyes were empty sockets, their skin stretched taut across bone, their mouths open in silent screams. They began to reenact a horrifying scene. One figure, seemingly the foreman, berated another, smaller figure. Then, with a sickening crunch, the foreman brought a pickaxe down on the smaller figure's head. The other figures joined in, their pickaxes rising and falling in a terrifyingly synchronized rhythm. I watched in horrified fascination, my mind struggling to comprehend the gruesome tableau unfolding before me. It wasn't a performance. It was a memory, a horrific echo of the past playing out before my eyes. These weren't ghosts, they were something else. Trapped between worlds, their agony forever etched into the fabric of this desolate place. The figures continued their grim reenactment, their movements becoming increasingly frenetic. The ground shook violently, the screams echoing off the mountains. I turned to run, a primal terror gripping my heart. As I stumbled away, I saw something even more horrifying. The figures were no longer focused on their gruesome task. They were looking at me. Their empty sockets seemed to bore into my soul, their silent screams now directed at me. And then, as the ground split open beneath me, I understood. I wasn't just a witness. I was the next participant in their eternal torment. Story 36. The salt spray stung my face as I rounded the bend, the Kenai Peninsula stretching out before me like a slumbering giant. I was transporting medical equipment down to Seward, a welcome change from the endless cabins I usually carried. Ahead, nestled against the cliffs, I saw a cluster of buildings I hadn't noticed before. Smoke curled from a central chimney, a comforting sight against the encroaching gray of the Alaskan evening. My fuel gauge was flirting with empty, so I figured I'd check it out, maybe grab some coffee and ask about a local gas station. As I pulled closer, the details became clearer and less comforting. The buildings weren't wooden cabins like I'd first thought, but something older, made of dark stone, almost blending with the cliff face. Crude carvings, depicting what looked like killer whales, adorned the walls. A shiver traced my spine, a primal unease settling in my gut. Still, I needed fuel, and my bladder was screaming. A group of figures emerged from the largest building, their forms obscured by thick, dark robes. They moved with an unnatural grace, almost gliding across the uneven ground, their faces hidden by deep hoods. Their silence was unnerving. No greetings. No curious stares at the newcomer, just a silent, watchful presence. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the sudden quiet. The figures didn't react. They simply parted, forming a path leading to the largest building, as if inviting me in. My apprehension gnawed at me, but the lure of warmth and caffeine overpowered my better judgment. I parked the rig, grabbed my jacket, and climbed out. The interior of the building was dimly lit by flickering torches, the air thick with the smell of salt and something faintly metallic. like blood. Tapestries depicting killer whales in various poses, some almost human-like, covered the walls. In the center of the room, a fire roared in a stone hearth, casting dancing shadows that seemed to squirm and twist with a life of their own. The robed figures had gathered around the fire, their backs to me, their silence broken only by the crackling flames and a low, rhythmic chanting I hadn't noticed outside. The chanting was in a language I didn't recognize, a series of clicks and croaky tones that resonated deep within my chest, setting my teeth on edge. A figure detached itself from the group and slowly turned towards me. The hood fell back, revealing a face that was both familiar and disturbingly alien. It was Charlotte, a waitress from the diner in Anchorage, a place I frequented on my routes. But her eyes, normally warm and welcoming, were now cold and vacant, her pupils dilated, almost black. A chilling smile stretched across her lips. "Join us, brother," she said, her voice a melodic whisper that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the building. "The orca awaits." My heart hammered against my ribs. I wanted to run, to scream, but my limbs felt heavy, my voice trapped in my throat. Something about Charlotte's presence, the chanting, the atmosphere of the place, held me captive. She gestured towards the fire. On a flat stone in the center of the flames, I saw it, a crudely fashioned altar made of walrus ivory, stained dark with what looked suspiciously like dried blood. And lying on the altar, a leather-bound notebook. My notebook. The one I always carried, filled with scribbled notes, maps, and idle doodles. I recognized the page open on the altar. It was a drawing I'd done a few weeks ago, a whimsical sketch of a killer whale leaping from the waves, its jaws open in a playful grin. Now, illuminated by the firelight, the drawing seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the whale's grin taking on a predatory quality. The chanting intensified, the clicks and croaky tones becoming clearer. Resolving into words I finally understood. They were calling to the orca, offering a sacrifice. And the sacrifice, it became terrifyingly clear, was me. Charlotte reached out, her hand surprisingly strong as she gripped my arm and pulled me towards the fire. The other figures closed in, their faces now visible in the flickering light. Truckers, all of them. Faces I recognized from the road, from diners and rest stops along the Alaskan highways. Their eyes, like Charlotte's, were vacant, their smiles chilling. They were no longer the wary, solitary souls I knew, but something else entirely, something devoted. They began to chant louder, their voices merging into a single, resonant drone that vibrated through the room. Through me. I struggled against their grip, a primal terror gripping me, but their combined strength was overwhelming. They dragged me closer to the fire, closer to the altar, closer to my own whimsical drawing, now transformed into a symbol of my impending doom. Charlotte produced a wickedly curved knife from beneath her robes, its blade glinting in the firelight. She raised it above her head, her eyes locked on mine, her smile widening. The chanting reached a fever pitch, the room spinning around me. Then, the ground beneath us began to tremble. A deep, resonant thrumming filled the air, vibrating through the very foundations of the building, drowning out the chanting. The fire in the hearth flickered and died, plunging the room into near darkness. The figures around me froze, their smiles faltering, their eyes widening with a mixture of fear and awe. A deafening roar echoed from outside, shaking the stone walls. The ground lurched again, and a massive crack split the floor, widening into a gaping chasm. A sickeningly sweet smell, like rotting fish and something metallic, rose from the depths. And then, from the chasm, a massive, inky black form emerged, its eyes glowing with an eerie, phosphorescent green. It wasn't the playful, leaping orca of my drawing. This was something ancient, something vast and powerful, something hungry. The figures around me screamed, their devotion instantly replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. They scrambled away from the chasm, their robes tangling around their legs, their screams echoing off the stone walls. Charlotte dropped the knife, her eyes wide with horror, and turned to flee. But it was too late. The orca, its jaws wide, lunged from the chasm, engulfing Charlotte in a single, swift movement. Her scream was cut short, replaced by a sickening crunch. The other figures, trapped between the creature and the collapsing building, met similar fates, their screams blending into a terrifying symphony of death. I stood there, frozen in terror, watching as the orca, its massive form silhouetted against the faint light filtering in from the newly formed chasm, devoured its worshippers. My notebook lay open on the ruined altar, the drawing of the leaping whale now stained crimson. I had offered them a playful god, and they had delivered me a monster. Story 37. The Yukon stretched out before me, a vast canvas of white and gray under a sky the color of a bruise. Up here, even in late spring, the air held a bite, a constant reminder of winter's lingering grip. I was hauling a load of concrete sections for a new bridge project near Prudhoe Bay, a job that paid well enough to justify the bone-jarring monotony of the Dalton Highway. It was just past midnight when I saw it, a flicker of unnatural green in the distance. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the light, the aurora playing games in the long twilight. But as I drew closer, the glow intensified, pulsating with a sickly rhythm. It was emanating from a roadside copse of stunted spruce, their gnarled branches twisted at impossible angles. Slowing the truck, I peered into the trees. The green light seemed to cling to something at the heart of the copse, something large and shifting. An unsettling wariness settled in my gut. This wasn't normal. This wasn't anything I'd seen in all my years navigating these desolate roads. Suddenly, the pulsating intensified, and a gravelly roar, unlike anything I'd ever heard, tore through the night. It wasn't the roar of a bear, or a moose, or any animal I could name. It was deeper, laced with a chilling resonance that vibrated through the very frame of the truck. My foot slammed on the accelerator. I didn't need to see more. Whatever lurked in those trees, I wanted no part of it. But the encounter wasn't over. Miles down the road, my headlights caught a movement at the edge of the highway. A massive shape, silhouetted against the snow, lumbered into view. It was a grisly, but distorted, grotesque. Its fur seemed to shimmer with that same unsettling green luminescence, and its limbs were abnormally long, almost skeletal. Its head was disproportionately large, and its eyes, they glowed with an unnatural, malevolent intelligence. The mutant grizzly let out another ear-splitting roar and charged. I swerved, the truck's tires spitting gravel as I fought to maintain control. The creature slammed into the side of the trailer, the impact throwing me against the steering wheel. The metal groaned, and a sickening screech filled the cabin as the grizzly's claws tore through the steel. I floored the accelerator again, the truck roaring back to life. The grizzly, surprisingly fast, kept pace, its claws scraping against the metal, sending shivers down my spine. Glancing in the side mirror, I saw it, a glint of metal amidst the matted fur. A metal collar, partially embedded in the flesh of the creature's neck. It was a research collar, the kind used by wildlife biologists. Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just a random mutation. This was a science experiment gone horribly wrong. The grizzly roared again, and I realized with a sickening lurch that it wasn't just trying to kill me. It was trying to get inside. It lunged again, its claws finding purchase on the trailer door. With a horrifying shriek of tearing metal, the door ripped open. I caught a fleeting glimpse of the creature's grotesque face, its teeth bared in a terrifying snarl, before it disappeared inside the trailer. My mind raced. I couldn't stop the truck. Not on this treacherous stretch of highway. I had to do something. Anything to get rid of that thing. An idea born of desperation sparked in my mind. I remembered the concrete sections I was hauling. Each one weighed several tons, if I could just. Gripping the steering wheel, I took a deep breath and yanked the release lever for the trailer's hydraulics. The trailer bed began to tilt. From behind me, I heard a furious roar as the grizzly scrambled for purchase. The truck swayed precariously as the concrete sections began to shift. Then, with a deafening rumble, the first section slid off the trailer, crashing onto the highway below. Another followed, and another, until the trailer was empty. The truck lurched forward, freed from its burden. I glanced in the side mirror one last time. The mutant grizzly was gone. All that remained was a mangled trailer door and a growing pile of concrete sections in the middle of the Dalton Highway. A chilling monument to my encounter with the creature. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it wasn't over. That somewhere out there, in the vastness of the Alaskan wilderness, the mutant grizzly was still alive, still hungry, and it would be back. Story 38. The ice spoke to me, not in words, not at first, but in a resonance that vibrated deep within my bones, a humming that seemed to emanate from the glaciers themselves. I'd been hauling a load of portable houses up the Dalton, a road I knew like the back of my hand, a route I'd always found strangely comforting in its desolate emptiness. This time, though, the vastness of the Alaskan interior felt different, oppressive. It started subtly, a low thrumming that I initially dismissed as the tires on the frost-heaved asphalt. But it grew, intensified, becoming a constant, almost physical presence inside the cab. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, like the rustling of wind through the stunted pines, they gradually wormed their way into my awareness, insinuating themselves into the silence. I told myself it was exhaustion, the long hours, the monotony of the endless highway. Cabin fever, maybe. But a deep, primal unease began to take root. The glaciers, normally majestic in their icy silence, now seemed to pulse with a hidden life, their surfaces shifting, their crevices deepening into bottomless abysses. They whispered of forgotten things, of ancient rituals and beings that slumbered beneath the ice, waiting. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, weaving themselves into fragmented phrases, hints of a knowledge that both terrified and enticed. They spoke of a power that could be mine, a transcendence beyond human comprehension, if only I listened, if only I followed. Then the ice began to melt, not in the gradual thaw of spring, but in unnatural patterns, forming symbols I vaguely recognized from faded museum exhibits, ochre pictographs depicting strange, elongated figures with too many limbs. The figures began to move, to dance across the glacial surfaces, their movements fluid and unsettlingly synchronized. The whispers now formed sentences, commands urging me to leave the highway, to follow a barely perceptible track leading into the heart of the Brooks Range. I fought against the compulsion, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles were white, but the whispers intensified, promising knowledge, promising power, promising an escape from the mundane existence that had always chafed at me. I pulled off the highway. The track was little more than a frozen scar across the landscape, barely wide enough for my rig. The whispers guided me, the glaciers looming on either side, their icy breath washing over the truck. The symbols on their melting surfaces became clearer, more detailed. The figures now undeniably three-dimensional, their forms shifting and contorting as they danced their silent ritual. The track led to a plateau, a desolate expanse of wind-swept tundra. In the center stood a circle of stones, crudely fashioned, almost swallowed by the encroaching darkness. The whispers urged me closer. As I stepped out of the cab, the thrumming reached a fever pitch, resonating through the very ground beneath my feet. The figures on the glaciers descended, gliding across the ice with unnatural speed, their forms solidifying as they approached. They were tall and gaunt, their skin a sickly yellow, their limbs elongated and impossibly thin. Their faces were smooth, devoid of features save for gaping, lipless mouths. They surrounded me, their silence more terrifying than any scream. And then, they began to chant. The rhythmic clicking of their mandibles, once a faint whisper, now filled the air, a sickening counterpoint to the drone emanating from the glaciers. The symbols on the ice pulsed with a cold, otherworldly light. The figures reached out, their impossibly long fingers brushing against my skin. The whispers intensified, promising knowledge, promising power, promising oblivion. They were not offering, they were commanding. And I, stripped of my will, of my very self, could only obey. I joined their chant, the clicking of my own teeth a horrifying echo of their chorus. My body moved involuntarily, mimicking their fluid, unsettling dance. I felt a strange euphoria wash over me as the whispers promised secrets, revealed truths beyond human comprehension. Truths about the universe, about reality itself. Truths that shattered my sanity. The ice continued to melt, the symbols shifting, rearranging themselves into new and terrifying configurations. The figures pressed closer, their cold skin against mine, their lipless mouths opening wider, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. I understood then. They were not offering me power. They were consuming me. The last thing I saw before the darkness claimed me, before the whispers became one with the terrifying drone of the glaciers, was my own reflection in their melting surface. My face was smooth, featureless, my mouth a gaping, leapless hole. I had become one of them, another guardian of the ancient horrors that slumbered beneath the ice, waiting. Story 39. The Dalton Highway unwound before me, a gray ribbon against the muted ochre of the Alaskan fall. This run was different. I was hauling a sealed container, 20 feet long, marked only with a series of cryptic symbols. My dispatcher, a woman named Olivia, was unusually tight-lipped about its contents, simply stating it was a government project. She offered me double my usual rate, and the lure of easy money overpowered any sense of unease. A few hours out of Fairbanks, a thick fog rolled in, swallowing the landscape. The air grew cold, a biting chill seeping through the insulated walls of my cab. Then it started a low, rhythmic humming, almost below the threshold of hearing. I chalked it up to the fog, the vastness of the Alaskan interior playing tricks on my mind. As I approached a small, nameless lake cloaked in mist, the humming intensified, resonating in my teeth. I glanced at the lake's surface. It was strangely agitated, rippling despite the absence of wind. A dark shape moved just below the surface, vast and serpentine. Panic clawed at my throat. I'd heard whispers in truck stops, campfire tales of something dwelling in the remote Alaskan lakes, something ancient. I dismissed them as folklore, until now. The shape broke the surface. It wasn't a serpent, not exactly. It was more humanoid, yet grotesquely elongated, with limbs that seemed too long, too flexible. Its skin was a sickly, translucent gray, revealing a network of pulsating veins beneath. Its face, if you could call it that, was a smooth, featureless expanse except for a lepless mouth that split open in a silent scream. The creature fixed its gaze on me, and a wave of pure, visceral terror washed over me. The humming reached a fever pitch, and I slammed my foot on the accelerator, desperate to escape the creature's unsettling gaze. The fog seemed to cling to me, slowing my progress. The humming followed, a constant, throbbing presence. Then, a new sound joined the chorus, a clicking rhythmic and precise, like thousands of tiny claws tapping against metal. I glanced in my side mirrors. Nothing. But the clicking grew louder, closer. The first fox appeared about an hour later. It darted across the road in front of me, its eyes glowing with an unnatural yellow luminescence. I almost hit it, swerving to avoid the creature. I saw another, then another, and another appearing from the fog like phantoms. They weren't behaving like normal animals. They moved with an unnerving synchronicity, their bodies low to the ground, almost gliding. Their numbers multiplied, a silent, flowing river of yellow eyes. They started flanking my truck, keeping pace, their clicking growing into a deafening cacophony. I saw their teeth then, needle-sharp, glinting in the headlights. They weren't foxes, not anymore. Something had changed them, twisted them. They began leaping at the truck, their claws scraping against the metal, their bodies impacting with a sickening thud. The clicking was almost unbearable. It filled the cab, resonating in my skull. A maddening counterpoint to the low hum that still vibrated through the very frame of the truck. I pressed harder on the accelerator, my knuckles white against the wheel. But the foxes kept pace. Their numbers growing, a living, breathing blanket of fur and teeth. The truck began to sway under their combined weight, and a chilling certainty washed over me. They weren't trying to kill me. They were trying to slow me down. The truck lurched violently. I'd hit something, or something had hit me. Through the frosted windshield, I saw the lake again. The fog was thinning, revealing the creature standing on the road ahead, its impossibly long limbs spread wide, blocking my path. The foxes swarmed the truck, their clicking now a deafening shriek. I felt the metal groan under their combined assault, claws finding purchase, tearing through the steel. I fumbled for my phone, but my fingers were numb, clumsy. The humming intensified, vibrating through my bones. The cab began to fill with a sickly sweet smell, like overripe fruit rotting in the sun. The faces of the foxes pressed against the windows, their yellow eyes burning into mine, their mouths open, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. They weren't animals anymore. They were something else, something inhuman. The creature outside reached down, its long, spindly fingers wrapping around the hood of my truck. The metal groaned, twisting under its grip. I heard the glass crack, spiderwebbing outwards. The sickly sweet smell grew stronger, almost overpowering. I caught a glimpse of the creature's face, its lepless mouth splitting further wider into a grotesque, impossible grin. The glass shattered inwards, showering me with shards. The foxes surged inside, their clicking mandibles tearing at my flesh. The humming reached a deafening crescendo, drowning out all other sounds, all other thoughts. The sickly sweet smell filled my lungs, replacing air. I saw the creature's face inches from mine, its empty eyes burning with a cold, alien light. Then, darkness. My last memory is of the humming, the clicking, and the sickeningly sweet smell, a chilling reminder of the lake monster's revenge. Story 40. The scalpel, cold and impossibly sharp, traced a line across my forearm. I watched, detached, as a thin crimson bead welled, then flowed, joining the intricate network of similar lines already carved into my skin. The creature wielding the blade, if you could call it a creature, hummed a melody, oddly soothing, like a lullaby from a forgotten world. Its face, a smooth expanse of pale flesh devoid of features except for two large, black orbs, tilted in what I interpreted as curiosity. It wasn't pain I felt, but a strange, chilling fascination. This was it. The culmination, the final act of their grotesque opera. My transformation. How did I get here, strapped to this crude operating table beneath the sickly yellow light of their ship? It started innocently enough. A detour. I'd picked up a load of tents destined for a new eco-resort somewhere near Denali. The dispatcher, a jovial woman named Marcy, mentioned a shortcut. A barely there track cutting through the Rangel Mountains. Shave off a good day, she said, winking. The money was good, enough to finally replace the busted transmission in my old Kenworth, so I agreed. The track was rougher than advertised, a teeth-jarring ordeal that had me cursing Marcy with every bone-rattling bounce. Dusk settled, painting the peaks in shades of bruised violet and deep indigo. Then the fog rolled in, thick and impenetrable, swallowing the world in a silent, white embrace. I was hopelessly lost. The GPS blinking uselessly, searching for a signal it would never find. That's when I saw it. A faint, ethereal glow pulsating through the fog, like a beacon from another dimension. Against my better judgment, or perhaps fueled by a morbid curiosity I couldn't explain, I drove towards it. The glow intensified, revealing a metallic, disc-shaped object nestled in a small clearing. It wasn't burning, not exactly, but radiating an unnatural heat that seemed to warp the air around it. I stepped out of the cab, a sudden, inexplicable calm washing over me. This was unlike anything I'd seen, unlike anything I could have imagined. Figures emerged from the fog, their forms tall and slender. draped in what looked like shimmering fabric woven from moonlight. They didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but their presence exuded an unnerving serenity. They gestured towards the craft, a silent invitation. My legs moved involuntarily, carrying me towards the gaping maw of an open hatch. Inside, the air hummed with a low, resonant frequency that vibrated through my bones. The walls pulsed with a soft, organic light, and strange symbols, unlike any alphabet I'd ever seen, danced across the surfaces. The figures led me deeper into the heart of the ship, a labyrinth of corridors and chambers filled with glowing orbs and humming machinery. It was then, a creeping unease finally taking root, that I realized I was not a guest, but a specimen. The next few days, or perhaps it was weeks, time became a fluid, meaningless concept within those metallic walls, were a blur of bizarre examinations and procedures. They studied me, prodded me. Their smooth, featureless faces inches from mine. They injected me with strange, viscous liquids that shimmered with an internal light. They attached sensors to my skin that pulsed with a rhythmic hum. There was no malice in their actions, only a chilling, clinical detachment, as if I were nothing more than a particularly interesting insect pinned beneath their microscope. Then came the carvings. The symbols, they explained, or rather, I understood. For they communicated not through words but through a direct transference of thought, were a language, a code, a key. They were rewriting me, transforming me, preparing me for something I couldn't quite comprehend. And now, here I am, watching the final symbol being etched into my flesh. The humming intensifies, filling the chamber, filling my mind. The ship vibrates, a deep, resonant thrum that shakes the very foundations of my being. The figures around me begin to chant, their voices rising in a crescendo that seems to tear at the fabric of reality. The symbols on my skin glow, burning with an intense, otherworldly light. I feel a strange energy coursing through me, a power I've never known, a power that both terrifies and exhilarates. The chanting stops, the humming fades, the figures step back, their black orbs fixed on me, their faces tilting in what I now understand is not curiosity, but anticipation. The transformation is complete. I am no longer just a trucker, I am something more. Something other. The hatch opens, revealing the fog-cloaked clearing, the wreckage of their ship a silent testament to their arrival. They gesture towards the opening, another silent command. I rise from the table, my legs feeling strangely light, my mind filled with a newfound clarity. I walk towards the hatch, a strange, almost euphoric calm washing over me. I don't look back. I don't need to. I know they are watching. They are always watching. And I know, with a chilling certainty, that this is not the end, but the beginning.